Hey, I'm Matt Stauffer, and I built an incredible team of developers at Titan. My goal here is to teach you how to build or improve your dev team, working through things like how to create a positive and productive dev team culture, how to hire and manage developers and where to place them within your team, how to exist as a dev team inside your larger organization, how to manage other leadership logistics like estimation and finances, and more. So let's jump in. So when my business partner, Dan Sheets, and I created Titan in the first place, we really wanted to care for people. We wanted to create great jobs. And it wasn't obviously the most natural thing for people to decide to do, but it just really was what we focused in. And we didn't even totally realize at the beginning that that's what we wanted to do. But we brought in a brand consultant to start figuring out, who are we as a company and what do we really want to do? And as we started talking about kind of all the words and phrases that really aligned with us, we started saying, oh my gosh, we have this shared vision of doing right and doing good. And a couple years in, we wrote it up and we called it the Great Titan Experiment. We said we wanted to create a place we actually wanted to work for. And that's a lot to say because we had both worked at places that weren't like that. I want you to come in on the weekend and, do your TPS reports. And we were really tired of living life that way. We wanted to find and help create a better way. But along the way, one of the things we found is that if your company and organization is structured around taking care of people and giving them a great place for them, those people who are happy and healthy and in a supportive environment are actually the most productive. They're most effective. So even if your goal in creating a company or a development team is to make a high productivity, highly effective, super expert dev team, it turns out this is still the way to do it. So if you build the best system in the entire world, but you put the wrong people in it, it's not going to do you any good at all. People are the absolute foundation of everything you do in building a dev team. And at Titan, we're really kind of structured around this idea because we understood the people long before we understood the systems. When you look at our core values, the number one core value at Titan is trust comes first. Because if you can't trust the people you're working with, everything else is going to fall apart. And that's true for employees, that's true for bosses, that's true for your clients or whatever else. If you don't have trust, no other systems will work because people aren't going to trust that you're going to follow the system. They're not going to trust that the system actually was designed for their good. The trust really is foundational. And if you think about a bureaucracy, a negative experience that you've had a bureaucracy or you've heard from somebody else having, thinking about the worst policies that they have. Those policies come from fear, from lack of trust or responses to bad actions that now they have to protect everybody from. There's a former employee of Titan named Dave Hicking. He's one of our alumni, is what we call our former employees. And he would often talk about the fact that a lot of structure in larger organizations is really just scar tissue. Some damage happened, some negative thing happened at some point in this history. Somebody did something, and a person looked at that and said, you know what I need to do? I need to make a policy to make sure that never happens again. And we could see this jokingly when you say, no shirt, no shoes, no whatever else, lots of places, and we laugh at when those get a little bit more excessive. Nobody can come here with a penguin. Well, what story kind of led to that, right? But when you find yourself in bureaucracies, more and more times when something goes the way people don't want, they say, we got to make sure that this never happens again. They had a person who did something they shouldn't have, which is, obviously a problem in the first place. But they respond to that by saying not, oh, let's figure out why that person was here, why they did that thing. They say, let's make sure this never happens again. And more just kind of systems and structures and processes get built on top, rather than identifying the core issue, which is usually about people and how people interact with each other. And one of the most important things about getting the people equation right is to have good people in leadership, good managers. Quality culture does come from the top, from the ownership, from the top level leaders, but it can be degraded if it filters through a bad medium. So if you've got this incredible leadership team with all this vision and all these kind of high quality values, and then they pass it on to people who are selfish and inconsiderate and, make people's lives difficult. It doesn't matter the ideals that you have if it's not actually the day-to-day life that people are interacting with. And I have a pretty small team, a couple dozen people. And even then, I'm at a large enough size that I'm not interacting with every member of my team every single day. And so the people that they interact with every day, those are those managers. And good managers are going to value their team members, and they're going to try and create a healthy culture for them. So good managers are not spending their time, trying to make sure that they look good. A good manager is empathetic and considerate and understanding and trying to make a better experience for the individual people who are under their team. And if you're thinking about kind of creating good manager culture and hiring good managers, you can ask yourself, would you want to work for this person? Would you believe that they're going to represent you honestly and advocate for your needs up to your boss? Good managers are going to advocate for and provide for their team. They can be honest to leadership about the team members' shortcomings for sure. They can say, they might have this problem or that problem, but they're going to do it in a way that is advocating. And if it is a real big issue, then they will have spent so much time and energy advocating for the members of their team that leadership will know that, hey, if there's something they said that's wrong, they're not going to jump to this immediately. So this is something we really need to pay attention to. And a good manager sometimes will even fight the boss. And that's a pretty impressive thing to find, is a good manager who is so strong and intent in advocating for their team that if you, the boss, are saying something, they say, nope, that's not the best outcome we have here. That's someone you want who's willing to stand up to you. So you might be saying, hey, if it's all about bringing in the right people, who are the right people? And before you hire anybody or build your team or even evaluate your existing team, it's really important to be able to answer this question of, what are we about as an organization? Who are we trying to be? What are we trying to do? What's our kind of long-term values? And it doesn't necessarily have to mean that you're doing like a formal vision casting seminar or a 5-year plan, but the company or the team or the organization should have some sense of, why are we doing this? What defines success or failure for our organization? And this will help guide who the right people are, because it's going to be the people who are going to fit well within that organization, who can be in line with your values. And it can also help you figure out how to evaluate and reward and guide the people who actually work there, because you know what they're supposed to be doing, what they're supposed to be about. It also helps the team be on the same page, because you could bring in good people, but they have a wide range of how they can possibly be as a person, right? And to say, these are the things that we want from you, these are the things that are rewarded, and these are the things that are not rewarded, helps them understand, okay, at this particular place in my life, at this particular company I'm working at, these are the values, these are what I should be focusing on. And it also helps people know what will not be tolerated. And even a very good person can behave in ways that they don't know are out of sync with the company's values, because they might be things that are normal to them. It also helps them know what they're safe from. And, you might operate out of some fear because at previous companies, XYZ might happen to you, but at this company, that is not viable. That cannot happen. That is not allowed. And so now they can operate out of more safety, or they can operate with more creativity and flexibility because they're not worried about those things. And we have lots of examples for this at Titan. It's going to be different for you. But for example, at Titan, we tell our team, clients can't force you to work over 40 hours. Their stress is not our stress. We say, hey, if you are going to hear bad news in an annual review, you're always going to know it long before the review. Nobody should ever worry about showing up to a review and, hearing really bad news in the review. They can be really scary things. They don't need to be for us. So we're basically just trying to say, like, what are potential things that can be solved by just communicating? What are we about? Who are we trying to be? And defining those values in a way that guides our hiring, that guides how we're interacting with our team, and guides what they should be doing and not doing as well. So set healthy expectations, be explicit as possible about them. We've got some core values that we have at Titan that we set so that we can help think about who are we hiring and help those people know what is valued in them. One of them is cancel hustle culture. We're not trying to hire the people who are the 10x developers who are total jerks to everybody around them and ignoring their families, or we have one that says weird means interesting, which helps us focus on the fact that we actually appreciate having people who are different from each other in their values and their experiences, and also they know that that's something valuable and that they should bring to us. Or we have one that's called you've already made it. We're trying to help people understand that this is not a place where you need to be showing how smart and how bright you are. You're already good enough, so now how can that define how you operate? And that helps us think who we should hire and help them know how they should behave. Or go home after 40, sometime in your first couple weeks at Titan, you're probably going to have somebody pull you aside and say, I know that you're kind of focused on this project, but you're limited to 40 hours. So please get out of here and don't do that next week. Now, having and defining your values is great, and it's a very important thing to do. However, it's fun to talk a good game. It feels really good. But everyone has had an experience with a boss or heard a story of one who's talked a good game when it's sexy to be the good boss, who's like, oh, I'm going to give you this, and well, we'll never do that, and we'll always allow this. And then the moment anything is difficult, they roll all of that back, and it turns out it was all just talk. It's almost a tech trope at this point. Some VC bro who's a progressive, caring CEO who treats the team like their family until things get difficult, and then they treat the team like they're garbage. And so this brings us to the concept of integrity. And integrity has a lot of definitions, most of which have to do with, moral uprightness and doing the right thing. But my favorite way of thinking about integrity is if you were to think about a different definition of integrity. This ship hull has integrity or has lost integrity from, naval things. For me, it's from, sci-fi. That integrity of the hull means it is consistent throughout. There's no holes anywhere. It is the same level of strength everywhere else. It is, every piece of it is doing what it's supposed to be. It's unified. It's lacking disruption or corruption. And so that means being the same person no matter where you are or who you're with or what circumstance you're in. Don't go back on your word, but also don't say things up front that it's going to be hard or difficult for you to follow through later. If you don't know you can do that, then don't say it when you're not actually being asked to do it. It means avoiding the temptation to say what people want to hear when you don't know if you can actually back that up. And so we want integrity in our organization at every level. The senior leadership has to show integrity. Our middle management has to show integrity, and the individual contributors also have to show integrity. And this all does still come back to trust. Can I rely on you to be who you said you were going to be at the beginning? Now, one thing I've found is that all of these things, defining our values, hiring good people, showing integrity, hinge on the culture of communication we've created at our organization. On my podcast, Business of Laravel, I ask business owners to talk about a lot of things, but one of them is what book or books have helped you get to the point where you are today in your business career if somebody else wants to kind of get there too. And you'd think it would be all these kind of like corny LinkedIn style, business analogy books. But the one book that has been mentioned more than any others is one of my favorite business books ever, which is Radical Candor. And if you're not familiar with the word candor, candor is the word that turns into candid, which if you can imagine someone saying, can I be candid with you? Which means, can I be honest? Can I be open or direct or forthright? It's about speaking the truth to people, not just when it's cool to speak truth, but also when it's not very fun to speak the truth. So this book is very much about how business environments do significantly better when people are able to be open and transparent and candid with each other. And it's very interesting because at the beginning of the second edition of the book, I believe it was, she actually mentioned how some VC bros, again, had taken advantage of that and said, oh, well, I'm just being candid when they were completely awful. And she mentioned in that first version that the original title of the book was actually Compassionate Candor, because it's not radical in that you're being a jerk even more than you were before. It's radical in that being candid and transparent and open with people can radically transform the amount of trust and care and safety we have in our workplaces. So what does it look like to apply radical candor in our dev shops? Well, we definitely should set our expectations up front. We should communicate up front, what are we about and what are we looking for? And one of the things that we talk about at Titan, one of our core values is be kind, speak truth, don't wait. So we want to focus on as soon as there's something that needs to be said, whether it's before someone gets hired or it's on their first day or it's as soon as the problem has happened, we're going to talk about that issue as truthfully and honestly and kindly as possible. And kind doesn't necessarily mean nice, doesn't mean we're dancing around the truth, but we're not being unnecessarily cruel or unnecessarily unkind. We want to build a culture of transparency, of trust, of safety, where the members of our team have seen the examples that we've set that we're going to communicate. And communication may not be easy every time, but it is the right thing to do. And if we're doing it openly and transparently, it can be safe because everyone is communicating this way. The leaders are communicating this way. And then we expect everybody else to communicate that same way. So we're modeling it and we're teaching it and then we're enforcing it. We say, this is what we expect of everybody. Everybody needs to be open and transparent and communicate like this. And a lot of this, even though it's kind of like had like a little bit of a somewhat positive, somewhat negative kind of spin, when we think about communication, we still more often assume positive than negative. But what if we're not talking about creative communication or planning communication? What if there's an actual explicit conflict that's come up? Often what happens is when we're trying to build these safe spaces and these kind of nice places, we end up building these kind of nice circles where nobody actually wants to bring up the negative thing or the conflict. At best because everybody's trying to be kind, at worst because they're worried that if they kind of speak up, they're going to get in trouble. And it's funny because every new developer that has joined Titan has been surprised to learn that Matt Stauffer, the Mr. Rogers of the Laravel world, turns out to actually be very direct and frank. And we kind of have this like your first time you get your code reviewed, or the first time there's a, you try to work 60 hours that week, even though you've been told not to, whatever, we can have a tough conversation, and being kind and being a considerate person does not mean not being direct. And so we definitely had a time in Titan's history where as we were growing larger, it was becoming more necessary for us to be intentional about our difficult conversations. And so I brought the whole team together and we read a book called Crucial Conversations. And it was basically a book all about what does it look like for us to have these hard conversations, not just the easy ones. I'd highly recommend checking out that book. I wish I could do a whole video on it. But having the skill of how to have healthy conflict and healthy conversations that are difficult and even potentially critical or disagreeing, it's really important to have a healthy dev team culture. When I say all these things about kindness and caring and safety, what I don't mean is we all just sit around and say nice things to each other all the time. What I'm saying is we are all capable of communicating the good and the bad. And think about the least healthy team culture you've been in. It's likely you're frustrated because there's a lack of communication. You're frustrated because the communication that's there is bad. Sometimes it's a lack of positive communication, but more often than not, it's ineffective conflict management. It's ineffective or maybe non-existent communication about difficult things. You don't feel safe or free to say what you don't like, or if you do, it's not listened to. So imagine that exact same scenario for that worst team that you've been in, but in that moment you felt free to speak up because it'd been modeled and approved, without threat to your job, and you know it'll be listened to and hopefully even acted on. All right, 2 more components in this video. First one, mutual improvement. One of the things that's a key focus in the Laravel community that makes it super attractive to outsiders is that the desire to help each other is a really high focus in the community. The most popular thing you can do in the community that's going to give you the most reputation is teach or help or create. And at Titan, we often hear our clients refer to something they often say is the Titan brain, the way you bring in 1 developer or 2 developers, but you get access to the entire team, plus the knowledge of people who often used to work there or leadership or whatever else. And so, this is fun because there's a good chance you have the author of the framework working with you or someone who's spoken or written on that project. And that is something we build through lots of very practical steps. And we'll talk about some of them later, things like pair programming and internal talks in 20% time. But the most important part about creating a healthy developer culture that's relevant here is we do it by encouraging people to be helpful to each other and hiring people who like helping each other. This aspect of developer culture where instead of having to compete with each other to prove that they're smarter and they're better in order to worry about their job, they can instead say, oh, I have a focus of helping other people. I have a focus of teaching the rest of my team. I have a focus of contributing to my team and to the broader Laravel community, allows us to have this Titan brain, because when somebody has done something, first of all, they're going to share it naturally, which means everybody else either knows it or knows this is the person to reach to. But second of all, even if you're not the developer in the project, you may not be the person getting all the credit. You still want to help because everyone is just there building each other up. And so that's a really incredible opportunity. And it's also a safety for people to just be able to help without worrying about how it makes them look. All right, our last one is the most directly practical. You want to offer good benefits to your employees. These are benefits that allow them to care for their family, like flexible hours and good health care, things that mean they don't have to worry about their family's health or their family's education or their own health, allow them to focus more on the job that they're doing. It's also the right thing to do, but like from a very practical perspective, it's actually very valuable to having this healthy developer culture. You want to help them learn? At Titan, we do 20% time, whereas 20% of your week can be spent kind of building your own knowledge base and what you're aware of in education. We also send folks to Laracon and sponsor them purchasing books and courses and everything like that. And you can also just prioritize the people in the most need when you're making decisions across the company. For example, every single time we have to choose which healthcare plan we're going to work with, there's a little bit of pressure to say, let's focus on the healthcare plan that makes it easier for people to handle their investing and minimize their tax advantage. And so far, at least every time we've said, actually, we're going to focus more on the plan that makes sure that people who are in difficult health situations are most likely to be able to take care of themselves versus the tax advantageous one. You really just kind of want to think about, like, in this benefits world, and that's technical benefits like, COBRA, healthcare, whatever, and also any other benefits. Hear their biggest concerns and try to address them. One example of how we're able to do this is we had several employees who were just constantly talking about, they're like, look, this 401k thing is cool, but it doesn't really matter to me to save for the future when I'm still drowning in student loan debt. So we looked into the opportunity for us to be able to give a small amount every single paycheck directly towards student loan debt. Things like that, or people talking about their difficulty with taking care of their pets when they travel or whatever else. Think through the things that matter and are difficult and are important and valuable to your team, and look for opportunities to care for those for them. So overall, the trick to creating this healthy developer culture is to focus on creating an environment where you yourself would want to go to work every day. If you were this employee, what would you want in a healthcare plan, or in a style of communication, or in a way of handling conflict, or in flexibility of work hours, or whatever else? Try to place yourself in their shoes, imagine what you would want, and create the environment you'd want to work in, and that's going to get you there. That will make it happen, and it's worth it. So productive development is what people are usually getting paid to do, right? Insert money and get back productivity or output. But there's a reason that how to create a productive development team wasn't the first video. Productivity happens in a development team by putting the right people in a healthy place and giving them the tools and processes to do their job. So you can't expect productivity from the wrong group of people with no understanding of the values and goals are in an unhealthy environment. But once we do have those things, what do we set up next? A lot of those individual pieces we're actually going to cover across the rest of the videos. But in this particular one, we're going to talk about some of the core understandings, the core pieces of what it looks like to create a productive development environment. Well, you'll be unsurprised to hear that the leadership of the organization is key to defining the productivity possibility for the people who are actually in the organization. Your leadership should be focusing first on hiring good people. And it's funny because the section after this is called people. And if you watch the last video, I talk a lot about people because that's actually the most important part of what we do in creating these productive development teams. Once you have good people, you can trust them. And then once you trust them, you can focus on building environments that are conducive to their productivity, rather than putting all your energy into covering your ass, measuring and micromanaging everything that they do, which is a really common kind of first step that leaders take when they don't know exactly what to do, is they just try to kind of control. They say, well, I must be involved in everything they're doing and I must make sure it's good enough. And if you just say, I believe that these are good people that are going to do good work, then you get to focus on, well, how can I make it even easier for them to do good work versus how can I make sure that they don't be the bad people that I inherently think that they are. So if you don't have good leaders, your best developers, in the face of being treated in that micromanagey way, they can't be productive because they're going to spend all their time doing things to satisfy the, inane desires of those leaders, and they'll leave. Or at very best, they'll do really good work for a while and then they're going to burn out and then they're going to leave. Or even if they don't leave, they're burnt out, which is not an ideal outcome for anybody. At worst, they're not going to be able to do the good work in the first place because bad leadership rewards the wrong things. Bad leadership is looking for, metrics. Have you done a certain number of these things? How many commits is a very common thing that we see, how many lines of code, how well do you follow particular strictures and structures? Whereas good leadership is trying to identify actual valuable output and also care for the people at the same time. And so if you are someone who cares about doing good work, cares about being honored and respected and being treated, like a decent human being, that bad leadership is going to make you feel like you're being rewarded for all the wrong things, you're being dinged for all the things that you shouldn't be, whereas that good leadership is going to make you feel happy and satisfied and like you're actually doing a good thing. So that bad leadership is going to get those good people, even if you found them in the first place, it's going to get them on a quick train out of working where you are. And good leaders also take opportunities to learn things that they don't even know about in the first place through one-on-ones. Good leaders are going to focus on understanding kind of how to say, well, what are some potentially harmful things here? What are some things that might get in the way of your productivity, and how can we address these things? And what are some benefits we can provide to you that will increase your potential for productivity and happiness? And we can talk a little bit later about what some common harms to productivity are, but if you're listening well in your one-on-ones, or even watching well in Slack, often in our context, you're going to find out a ton about what potential harms are to productivity and ways that you can be a part of making those harms to productivity go away. And you'll likely find that developers are extremely frustrated about things that hamper their productivity. I don't know very many developers who want to show up and just do nothing all day. They want to show up and feel like their work is respected, that they're seen as knowledgeable and capable experts, and then given the space to do so. And so when those things are not happening, which means the productivity of the company, the productivity of the team is being disrupted, they're going to let you know, because they're like, all I want to do is just good work that actually benefits the end client. And for X, Y, and Z reasons, I'm not able to. Well, great. They're going to let you know that. And now there's a productivity hamper that you can be a part of fighting. When you hire the right people, they're happiest when they can just flow code, right? When they can just flourish and just sit down and just say, I know what to work on. I'm going to do great work on it. And those good people are not happiest when they can skip work, right? They're happiest when they can do good work. And so if they trust you, they can tell you what things are getting in the way of them being able to do their work. And voila, some, actionable steps to make everybody more productive and happier while they're at it. I'm going to talk about people in every single video, so I'm trying to keep it short here, but I would say there's at least two really important things you can do for hiring people who are going to benefit the productivity of the team. And the first one is hire people who have shown they're capable of learning and teaching themselves. If you can see someone who's capable of growing, who's not just sitting waiting for somebody else to bring them along, but they do that work themselves, it's extremely valuable. And then second of all, hire people that you know you can trust. Someone you say, if I hand this to them and say, this is what you need to do, and then I disappear and they could just slack off, when I come back, I know it's going to get done. And then take those people and put them in environments where you help them learn and you trust them. You take good learners and help them learn, trustworthy people and trust them. It's going to go so far to help you build systems that do not require you to be concerned with how much they know, concerned with how reliable they are, or anything else, because they're just going to become little powerhouses of their own, and you can spend your time and energy on other things as a leader. And you do want to identify other potential harms to productivity. I mentioned how one-on-ones are a great space for you as a leader to identify the specific things that are going on with your team. But there's also some very common things that address and concern most people when it comes to their productivity. And so some things that are very commonly harmful to productivity is being forced to work at times that don't make sense for you personally, whether it's because on this particular day or every single day or a certain period of time, this is just not when you can be productive. Having to work when you actually need to be caring for your family, it's kind of like a part of that same thing. If I need to be going to pick my kids up from the school bus at 3:00 every single day, and I'm capable of doing that and just working an extra hour that night, then I'm not going to be stressed about, who do I get to go take care of the kids or what's going to go. I just say, you know what? I just disappear for a little bit at this time and I come back ready to go and grateful that I have a flexible job. Other things that are harmful to productivity, meetings. Meetings are harmful to productivity, all of them. Get rid of as many as you can. Anything else that is basically not doing the thing they're supposed to do. Timesheets, reporting the work that they're working on, emails. Oh my gosh, we're going to cover a whole bunch more over the span of this course. But basically anything that is not sitting a person down and saying, hey, you're set up well, you're rested, you're not distracted. Now do the thing that we hired you to do. Anything outside of that is harmful to productivity, and you should minimize it as much as possible. So let's assume we have a really fantastic work environment set up at this point. How well are your developers set up when they actually sit down to code? How capable are they of spitting out quality application code as soon as they sit down? How much time is wasted at the top of each project, or in each pull request, or in code review, or as they're planning or writing code? There's simple steps that we can take to minimize all of these distractions and frustrations. And I do want to say that a lot of this is going to come into videos later about our process as a company in terms of our tasking, and then our process as a company in terms of technology and development. So this is just kind of like a really quick taste, but it is relevant to this productivity thing. So first of all, don't cheap out on tech. They should have the devices they need to do their work. Laptop, keyboard, monitor, chair, whatever, the IDE, the SQL manager they want to deal with. These things are like the truck that a truck driver drives every day. Like truck drivers, it's got the right wheels and it's got the whatever else. Or these are the hammer and the screwdriver and measuring tape and pencil and saw for a carpenter. Yeah, it costs up front to get those things right, but a good tool does not make a good dev. But it is very difficult to have maximum productivity, if that's what we're talking about, out of your good developers if they don't have the right tools. So that doesn't mean they need the latest and greatest of every single thing, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be always free to give them everything they need. Second of all, it should be incredibly clear upfront how to spin up a new code base. Clear guidelines, clear setup instructions. Everyone should be able to get a new machine, clone down your code base, be up and running in minutes. Third, the processes in your organization should be super clearly defined. So what do I do when I check out the code base, when I'm branching, when I'm creating or reviewing a pull request? The clearer these things are, the less time and friction there is, or the less time wasted and the less friction there is every single time these things happen. And fourth, everyone at the company should know as quickly and easily as possible what good code means and what the minimum baseline is for good code. That makes it much more likely that people are going to write good code. It also shrinks the amount of time they're going to spend reviewing other people's code or actually even their own code to make sure it's good enough. And it significantly minimizes the amount of bike shedding your team engages in, which is basically wasting time talking about what's the best way to do a particular code thing instead of just doing the thing itself. And again, there's a video coming later specifically talking about these factors, but I at least want to introduce it in this productivity section because setting your developers up for success and productivity definitively requires you to have a thought or 7 about what is the best environment they can be set up in terms of their tech, their processes, their code, everything. So more videos across this course will continue to talk about tools and processes that you can use for productivity. I'm sorry I didn't cover all of them here, but we'll get there throughout the rest of this. But this video did cover the most important piece, which is to find good people who are trustworthy, who are capable, who have shown their ability to grow, and then support them in those things. Trust them. Instead of spending your time and energy making sure that they do what they're supposed to, give them resources to grow, but basically just let them do their good people stuff, right? And then your energy goes into building the opportunities for them to do what they're already going to do even more, even better. So you know how to find the right people, in theory. But when you find those people, how do you know which roles you're going to place them into? And how do you know who's responsible for what? It's easy to think that too much structure in your organization might take away our ability to be creative and to be flexible in our hiring and our placements. And that is possible. But it's also really valuable and beneficial to define some form of a hierarchy or structure, or if you have a more flat team, at least to define some kind of rules and expectations for what your team is going to look like. And this can relieve a lot of stress and prevent a lot of conflict between your team members when they actually know what they're supposed to be doing and who to report to and all of that. And there's also a lot of other benefits to creating a more structured or at least defined team shape when your team knows what's coming next in terms of where do they go after this. Is there an advancement track? So let's take a look at what building that development structure looks like. The first thing you're going to do is to draw out your ideal team layout for your development team. Who's connected to whom, who's on what team, who reports to whom, whatever else. This is less about your existing team layout, not even necessarily about your existing team. This is really just figuring out for the organization that you have, what makes the most sense in terms of what the structure in this organization is going to look like. And you want to make it clear in this layout who reports to whom, what defines one job or one team from another. And in this layout, you also probably have some overall hierarchies. For example, my director of engineering is going to be running one-on-ones with all of the developers, so they're all direct reports. But then sometimes there's also going to be some contextual hierarchies. For example, a lead programmer will always be the lead on a specific project. And so lead programmer might not be over other people, but in specific contexts, they will be. You're also going to want to write out, are your teams organized as full stack teams, or is there a back-end team or a front-end team? Whatever organizational systems that you need in order to figure out where are people and where are people in relationship to each other on this development team. Now let's pause for a minute because you're probably thinking, hey, I understand the idea of drawing out my development team, but tell me what I'm supposed to draw here, Matt. You're the teacher here, right? So I'm going to tell you what I think makes the most sense for the layout of a development team, especially when you're working in full stack Laravel. And this could be different in other contexts or even in Laravel teams different than mine, but this is what I have experienced being most beneficial at Titan and also most beneficial in teams that I've helped build through Titan. Small teams of full stack developers. One CTO or director of engineering type leader at the top, and then 3 to 5-ish small teams, each of which contain somewhere between 2 and 3 developers. And each of those teams contains one lead programmer or senior programmer. And everybody's involved in code, right? All 3 people in the project are code writing and code reviewing as well. And those leads are more like the architecture leaders, and they're the go-to person for technical questions. They're also the primary communicator with project managers or product owners or account owners or whatever your kind of like non-technical lead is. And they'll also, if you have clients, they'll lead the conversations with clients. And so that's what we have at Titan, and I think it works extremely well. We basically will take a given feature or set of features, and we're going to assign it to this team. And the project manager, together with the technical lead, figures out, what are we going to be working on? What are our tasks that we need to split up? And then they sit down and the programmers do the work, and they'll do some pair programming and some non-pair programming. Each developer can write code, but they also make sure they're reviewing each other's code. And in the end, the buck stops here with technical quality is going to be on each project with the lead, but they always have that CTO type person to turn up to and to say, hey, can you take a look over this for me? Or just know that they're going to be checking in regularly. And we could have grown a lot bigger at Titan, and we've actually gotten bigger at one point, but the point we got too big was when this setup started not making sense. And I have never been unhappier in the existence of Titan. And it kind of makes sense. I remember from what I did before Titan, I was working with nonprofits about, like how to organize people together. And one of the things we kept learning is that there's these different kind of like tiers of the size of an organization where the culture has to shift. And not everybody uses the same numbers, but often they're talking about how it's going to be at, 3, and it's going to be at 12, and it's going to be at 50 and 200. At each of these moments, there's kind of like a natural spot where you're going to be like, it's all going to make sense and we're all going to work together here. But when you start going above that, it starts not working, and you need to come up with a new system and a new structure for the new size. But also it's sort of like there's almost gravity to get to the next size. Those in-between sizes don't always make sense when you're too big for what worked at 12 and too small for 50 for various reasons. And so there's kind of like a momentum to get there. And we were kind of passing the one size, we're moving to the next size, and this kind of structure stopped working quite as well. And I hated it. And I'm very happy that the team size is where it is today. If I had to build a larger team in the future, what I'd probably do is just take this size, like I said, 3 to 5 teams, 2 to 3 people, and just build multiple units of that size. I really just think that this makes a ton of sense as a team shape. Now, in my mind, each of these individual teams needs at least 2 types of leaders, and they could be the same person, but at Titan we have them separate. And this is a technical leader and a process leader. And the technical leader is responsible for some of the things I've already talked about. They make architectural decisions, they decide, code style issues if they come up. They are the ones who are responsible for making decisions about what's happening technically. Whereas the process person is a little bit more responsible for kind of interpersonal interactions. They're scheduling meetings, they are planning, burn down charts or whatever kind of things you need to do. They're handling all the things that have to do with like the work of getting work done. Whereas the technical leader is handling the actual work, the structures and organizations of the work. And the technical leader does not have to be an interpersonal leader. It is valuable for them to be an interpersonal person in some ways because they should also be helping the individual team members on their development team grow. But it's not their job necessarily to interact with product or with business or with clients. So again, they're setting more kind of like code and architectural direction. They're going to review code, but I think everybody should review code. I think the most kind of like interactive thing that your technical leader is going to do outside of with the internal team is to participate in planning sessions with the client or with product or with business from a technical perspective. So they do need to at least kind of have that. But again, you've got this process leader. At Titan, we call them project managers. And they are handling a lot of behind the scene things like meetings and tasks and timelines, but they're also often handling first line communication with the client. They're leading those meetings with the client. Personally, I like it that our project folks are also kind of a little bit UX capable. They're doing, they're doing UX diagrams and wireframes at a lighter level. We'll put in a professional UX designer if we need. And they also manage all of our internal processes, like what are our check-ins, what are our timelines, how are we logging the work we're doing, and everything else. There's one last thing that's not specific to the project that you're on, but since we're talking about leadership, I want to mention it. I want your top-level technical leadership at your organization to be someone who is technical and has high power within the organization or high agency. They need to be technical enough to know what really matters to the development team, things like technical debt, and they need to be powerful enough to go to bat for those things. So if you're, let's say, the director, or I guess the VP of engineering or the CTO or whatever, the person you're not interacting with on a day-to-day, but the dev team eventually kind of reports the whole way up to them, if they're not capable of understanding when you make the pitch that we need to hit pause on product development for a little bit because we're getting, more and more technical debt, or if they are understanding it, but they're not capable of having like the leadership level to actually make that fight against other people at other senior levels of leadership, they're not going to be able to do what they need to do. So we need those two types of leadership on our teams, but then we need somebody above us who understands and can fight for us. Now, I said this before, but I personally think that the best team is a small full stack team. And I also want to name that they should have at most one junior developer on the project. There's lots of other different types of team organizations you can consider, and I want to tell you why I choose the one I just said versus those. And of course, you can choose whatever makes the most sense for your organization, but here's why I prefer those. So first of all, I like full stack over divided responsibility. So every single member of the team can build front end and back end versus there's a back end team and a front end team, or even teams, which I think is a little bit better, where every team has a back end dev and a front end dev or something like that. And it's because when you're separating teams like that, especially when it's a back end team versus a front end team, you are dividing folks. You're adding all sorts of unnecessary process and friction for every single feature that gets pushed out, every single bug that gets fixed. There's a lot more back and forth that has to happen between each of these, and so it drags out those cycles and it increases the time to production. If I have everybody's working on full stack and we get a feature definition, we can understand the feature and we can build the front end and the back end and push it to QA and then push it to production in days. It's very difficult to do that when you have these separated teams because each team has to do that same length of process. And so even if it goes from days to maybe just weeks, do that over and over and over again, and you're just going to find that the incremental friction cost from each of these kind of like these boundaries between teams is going to increase your cost and your time to do anything significantly. And I prefer a small team versus a large team because in a small team, every person does their work. There's no hiding, there's no bureaucracy. You know your job, you do your job. You know who your buddy is on the project, you partner with them on their work on the project. And with larger teams, it's much more likely to have little sections where people are just not getting work done, or they're hiding behind the fact that, well, I can understand that those three people are going to do the work, and so I'm going to hide the fact that I don't actually know how. On larger teams, you end up with I've said you don't want too much process or structure, but some is good. The bigger the team is, the more unstructured that team is, because now you just have a mob of 12 people all sort of doing the same thing and getting their individual assignments, but there's not clear delineations and definitions of, who reviews whose code or, who does which piece of what, or who do I pair with? The bigger the team is, the more it's just a mass of 12 people. Where at these smaller teams, it's very clear what role each person is taking on that team at any given moment. And why do I say max of only one junior developer? Well, junior developers add capacity a little bit, but they do that at the cost of the capacity of your more senior leaders. You can't just add 4 juniors to a senior thinking you're going to get the equivalent of, of course, not 3 devs or 4 devs, but you might think, adding 4 juniors gives me the equivalent of 3 more devs or 2 more devs. What really did is you just got 4 people who are doing bad work, and now you got a senior whose capacity to work is significantly diminished because it's almost a full-time job just managing the juniors they have in the project. And I love apprentice programs. I think apprentice programs are incredibly important for us to have a great pipeline for new developers. But the biggest mistake I see is folks trying to save money by throwing a bunch of juniors because they feel like they're really easy to hire on a project together with 1 senior or 5 seniors and 20 juniors or something like that. It's not the way to do it. Maximum 1 junior to every 2 programmers. Maximum. Okay, so let's say you've just laid out this ideal plan. There's 2 kind of ways to approach it. Are you just getting started, or are you working with an existing team? If you're just getting started, the first person to hire is your most technical person. This person's going to define the culture, the technical direction, the standards of your organization. So you want a CTO or a senior technical leader. The only way around this is if you temporarily hire that role by bringing in someone like Titan or a senior level contractor to be your senior dev as you hire more entry-level people. But I definitely would say no juniors until you have at least 1 fully functioning dev team working together. And even if you do use folks like Titan to set that up, you do eventually want to bring that senior person on earlier rather than later. Now, if you're working with an existing dev team, I told you originally to ignore your existing dev team, but now that luxury is past. I would say if you have this new ideal setup and you have your existing team, the first thing I would say is don't move people into leadership just because of their seniority or because of their technical ability. Take a look at your existing team and see how well they do or don't fit into your ideal team setup. And if you have people who don't fit, now is the time where you can take a breath and see, can you kind of finagle them into this new organization, but as a temporary thing, right? Just for this person or just for this person for now, as you work on a plan on figuring out how they can eventually move to where they actually should be. And this might not work for everybody. You may end up just having too many underperforming developers. And it's an awkward situation to be in because this move may make you realize that you need to let some people go. And that's not an exciting position to be in. And I hope that this course doesn't lead to people losing their jobs. But you need the team structure that will actually work for your organization. Whenever possible, also, instead of hiring in new people, it can be tempting, especially if you just heard me say, like if people aren't doing the job, you might have to let them go. Whenever possible, promote up from within. Train people up who are already in your organization and promote them up into higher leadership positions rather than hiring into higher leadership positions who've never worked here before. This gives you the benefit of people who really understand how you work. And also gives you the benefit of giving people the understanding that when they come in at a more entry level at your organization, there's a path for them for growth rather than just feeling like they're going to stay in this entry level position forever and you're just going to hire senior leaders in. Regardless of what needs you define, your needs today aren't necessarily going to be the same as your needs 5 years from now. So this system can change as your team and your needs change, but also as your understanding of your ideal setup changes. And so you really just need to stay agile, stay flexible, keep asking these questions of what is the ideal setup for your team. For me, the easiest part of running a dev team is finding good people. Getting business in my agency, it's a little bit less natural for me, but the people, super easy. But I hope that even though it's easy for me, I still can do a good job of sharing how I do it and making it a little bit easier for you. Before it comes to even putting up a job posting, there's 2 big things you can do to make the hiring process significantly easier. First of all, make yourself known. Get out there, talk about your company, teach in your respective area, share, give back, donate, contribute, sponsor things, help people know who you are, and also be a great place to work so that they want to work there. As you're building this reputation, it's not just a reputation that you do good stuff on the internet, but that brings attention to you, and then people start asking, well, what is it like to work there? And they can talk to your current employees, and so if it's a great place to work, they'll tell everybody else about it. The second thing is be active in the community just socially. So go to conferences, go to meetups or create your own meetups, hang out on Twitter, watch live streams, or connect on GitHub with who's working on the packages that you're working on. Getting to know people before you need them to come to you does a ton of good for you. The rest of the sections of this video will require you to at least have a baseline understanding of what job you're actually hiring for here. And it's funny, in jobs to be done, we say, what job are you hiring the tool to do, but right now I actually mean the human. What job are you hiring this human to do? What roles and expectations do they have? What are the systems and structures of their team? And if you take a look at a previous video here, I talked about how to structure your dev team. You need to have that structure so you can know what you're hiring this person into. Is it a junior role or a senior role or a mid role? Is it a CTO? Are they more technical project manager instead of actually programmer? Is it front end? Is it back end? Is it full stack? Are there additional technologies you need them to be experts at? There's so many things you need to define before you can write a job posting, before you can evaluate if somebody's good enough for that job. So before you even start any of that, what's the actual job? All right, now that you understand the job you're trying to hire for, you can actually start building your job posting. You want to define the specific job as narrowly as you can, really kind of talk about what the ideal will be. And we'll build a posting from there, and it might expand out some, but start with who's your dream candidate? Like brainstorm, who could this person be that really provides everything you want? Think about what good code looks like for your organization or a good member of your team looks like, and what characteristics you really value. Like at Titan, we like self-taught full stack developers who have a whole suite of other interests and experiences, who show great attention to detail and are extremely capable verbal and written communicators. That's the thing that we're looking for. And so our job posting is going to be asking about those things. And of course, it would also be great if they are, experts at DevOps or whatever else, but like those are our kind of top priority things. And then what you want to do is separate out your must-haves from your nice-to-haves. And you want to make that must-have list as short as possible, and the nice-to-have list can be literally as long as you want. And your must-haves are probably going to be things like Laravel programmer, JavaScript expert, database management guru, Ubuntu manager. The nice-to-haves are going to be more things like, stuff that it's valuable, but you don't have to have it. Experience with Azure, experience with machine learning, can speak Portuguese, whatever else it ends up being. And the must-haves often also are going to include some things like the time zone they work from, or their working hours, the ability to travel, fast internet, a decent camera, things that, if we don't have that, it's going to be actually a deal breaker. Nice-to-haves will be other things that are, based on experiences or specifics that they can learn on the job, but they have less to learn if they have those. And in this job description, you also want to talk about the company. Why would somebody want to work there? The job description is for the job that you're posting, but you want the right people to apply, and the more discerning person, the one you're more likely to want, is the one who's going to care more about your company and what's your culture like, what's unique about your mission, your people, why are you a better job than where they are right now or the other options they have available to them. And in the same direction, you also want to share about the benefits. Put as much information as you possibly can about pay, tangential benefits, fun aspects of company culture, things that will attract them. Especially table stakes such as does it have a 401k? Does it have insurance, health insurance, stuff like that? But, it really is special and sometimes legally required if you can even talk about the amount of pay that they're going to get or other financial benefits they're going to get. Now, throughout this job posting, as much as possible, you want to use real language. I kind of choked over the word guru earlier, but don't do that. You don't want to use sales bro language. You don't want to call people wizards or whatever else. You just talk about what they do. Talk about what they're going to be doing and what you want from them, and sort of describe this person in normal casual language like you talk, and also talk about yourself in normal casual language. Here's who we are, here's what we do, here's who you hopefully are, and here's what you hopefully can do. And the last thing I really want to say is you should set a timeline for the applications and when they're due. One of the things that's hardest about this process is lack of clarity and explanation of what people can expect as they kind of walk through the application process. And a way you can really help them is to say, all job descriptions must look like this, and they must be due by this point. And you can tell even further if you want. You can talk to them about what the entire job application process is going to be like, but you don't have to in the job posting. At least you should say, this is what we need from your application, and this is when it's due. And one last tip. If you are having trouble writing a job posting, especially if you have multiple roles in your company, it's very valuable to write a single kind of baseline programmer job description and then kind of scale that up and down based on seniority. So for example, at Titan, if we say, here's what a mid-programmer needs, for a senior programmer, we'll modify it to say they can do that without supervision, without a lead on top of, their code. Or if we're talking about a more junior one, they can say they can do those things with assistance. So that basic job description of just what a normal mid-level programmer can do is often the easiest thing to write first. Larajobs is the best place to find people who are dedicated to the craft of Laravel. For the people who are spending time in places, whether it's conferences or meetups or on Twitter or wherever else, where they're working together and connecting with other people who do Laravel, and they're really focusing on their ability to do Laravel well, those folks get into the Larajobs world because Larajobs is sponsoring those things and they're actively involved. So the best way to find the best Laravel people is on Larajobs. So now it is time for you to evaluate job applications. One thing I would recommend doing at the beginning is to find something that anybody, not your most senior hiring person, your most experienced person, but basically anybody who can read, can evaluate for, and then have them triage your initial applications, assuming that you have hundreds, which is often the case. Something like only accept people who live in this area, or only accept people who specifically name that they can do these particular technologies. And you want to have those folks, not just yourself, but those folks helping you on a rolling basis. So every day or a couple times a week, have all the triage people look together at all the applications and filter out the people who don't fit those baseline lists. And those folks also should have freedom, especially if you're one of those people, to add some kind of a special label to the people that really excite you, where you go, oh no, this is someone we really want to pay attention to. And that'll make life easier later. Once you're done with that, hopefully you're down to 30 to 60 good options. If you have less than 20, that's great. Just have your initial interview with all of them. But you're likely to have 20 plus people who end up in that circumstance. And so now I would go through and spend more attention, and you, the hiring manager, should be the person spending the most attention looking through that list and picking your favorites. And you want to think about things like personality and vibe, their unique experiences, or for any other aspects that you know would be valuable in this role that the triagers might not have known about. You know, their history of working in a particular tech stack, or are you familiar with their reputation, or did they make a package that you really respect, or whatever else. The goal is to try and get it down to somewhere between 10 and 20 people at this point. Anyone who's not moving on to the next stage, email them now. A form email to every single person is fine, but don't not email them. Don't leave them hanging. Send a quick email that says, thank you so much for applying. We won't be moving forward with your interview at this point. So they at least are aware that they're not just sitting waiting for you. And I do have one just kind of small pet peeve. I didn't know where to fit it in the talk, in the episode, but I just want to share this now. A senior non-Laravel developer is not a senior at a Laravel job. And that's something I'm mentioning at this point because you want to evaluate it, and it might look like they're senior. You say only accept people who are senior developers who have X number of years. Well, if all those years or all that experience is working in a non-Laravel space, that doesn't mean they can step instantly into your senior Laravel position. So that doesn't mean don't talk to them, but I want to flag that as a concern. Senior Laravel developers have senior Laravel experience. And now it's time to conduct your interviews. Most people have multiple rounds of interviews, often 10 and 15. I would say figure out what works for you, but try as hard as you can to keep it to less than 5 interviews for every single person if possible. And before the interview, there might be a step you want to take. One thing we like to do is coding challenges, where we say, hey, can you take home this coding challenge and come back, spend no more than 4 hours on this, so we don't feel too bad about making them spend a week working on something. Give them, preferably the ability to do at least over a weekend, so that if they say, what I'm supposed to do this, after I do my day job and then go home and be a parent, and then I'm exhausted at the end of the night and try to find time with my spouse, and now I have to fit 4 hours in, give them at least a weekend, and then evaluate that. And sometimes you may or may not have that as a part of the interview process, or you might evaluate before you send them to interview. But at some point, it's time to actually talk to them in person. And at Titan, we do our first short call for that 10 to 20 people that I call the not an axe murderer chat, which is just like a casual conversation. You could call it a culture fit, but I'm a little wary of that. And the main goal is just to say, like, can I have a conversation with you? Can you communicate well? Do we actually enjoy being on a call together? If anybody doesn't make it past here, send them a form email rejection right away. Don't hit these next moments of rejection or acceptance without letting the rejected people know that they're no longer in the running. Then you're on to a technical interview. At Titan, we go for a relatively short, a very practical interview, as close as possible to real life. So it's more going to be about reading code, which you can do effectively in a call, and less writing code, which nobody can do effectively in a call with somebody staring at them without access to their normal tooling and everything like that. It's not going to work. So we're also not talking about things that you wouldn't do as a part of the job. So we're not doing linked lists on whiteboards or any of the other kind of Google and Facebook and Apple type challenges that have nothing to do with our day-to-day job. The goal is to find out, can this person in a reasonable scenario do the things we need them to do in the day-to-day job? And so find things that have been pulled from actual challenges that you run into at your job, and then ask them about them. And the goal here is to get down to probably 3 to 5 people or even less that you could hire. The goal is saying every single person at the end of this, period, I could hire them today. I don't know which one's exactly best, but I definitely can imagine them working for us. Send a form email or even a personalized email to the remainder of your 15 to 20 people saying, thank you so much, it didn't work out this time. And then sit down and give these last few people just some time to think about. Talk through it with the team, with your spouse, take a walk, maybe even do one more interview with other team members so that they can kind of give an input if it's not super clear. And just think about, what would it be like to work with this person day to day? Who are you excited about joining you? What aspects of this process have led you to say, oh, I don't even know that this was something I originally valued, but when I've seen it in this person, we want it here. And allow that to help different people bubble up until you eventually know who that one person is that you're going to hire. And finally, you've got your person. It is time to send out a job offer. Now at Titan, we don't actually send out the offer immediately. What we do is we send out a more informal email to kind of hash out some details. And so we'll say things like, let's work on the specifics of the pay if we have not figured them out by now. Let's talk about timing. One thing I often recommend with people is, if you can afford to do so, encourage the person who is joining your team to take 1 to 2 weeks off between their previous job and working for you. It's basically free vacation, assuming they can handle it financially because they're not getting paid during that time. But often facilitating when our vacation is going to be can be really difficult, especially in the US. And so it's something that people don't think about, that it's actually fine to just wait a couple weeks to join. And usually when we're in the hiring process, we're not absolutely so urgent that we can't afford to wait 1 week or 2 weeks for them. And so that's a really great way for them to have a little bit of breathing space, but also for you to get somebody joining you after a few weeks of rest versus after the crazy last couple of weeks of transitioning it out of another job. Once you get all these specific details figured out, it is actually time to send out that formal offer letter. So you put it together in whatever tool you're using. It's the very legal, official offer. And, once you get all the details in there, you send it out. And this should be exciting and also kind of scary. We're always nervous when we're sending out an offer. It's like I kind of watch those people waiting to see if they're going to get signed to a football team. And obviously it's not that big of a deal, but we've offered a job to someone who are really excited to join. And now we're just sitting here kind of checking our phones every 5 minutes to see if they said yes, and it's really a big deal. And I hope that, folks who apply to our job who are down to those last rounds are also in that same place of like, am I going to get the job? Are they going to offer it to me? So when they say yes, celebrate yourself, celebrate with your team, celebrate with them, tell them how excited you are to have them. And then it's time to hand it off to the onboarding team. And you have one last responsibility left, which is to send the emails to the remaining 3 to 5 or 2 to 4 at this point people who didn't get the job, but who you could have imagined working with you. This is not a form email. This is a personal email. These are people who have been through many rounds of interviews with you. And you also want to hang on to those relationships with them next time. The next time you need to hire, do you want to work through 500 applications, or pick one of these people who you've said today, yeah, I'd be happy to work with them, right? And you know them and you've been thinking about your interview experience with them for the months or years it is between. That's a person you want to hang on to their information. So send them a kind, gentle email where you express your desire to work with them down the road and apologize that it's not them this time. And now, take a break, go for a walk, celebrate with your team. You did a lot of work, and hiring is a lot of work. And even though, of course, the people getting hired or not hired are having a little bit more of an up and down, it's important to understand the drain it puts on you to do the hiring. And so when you're done, you don't just go back to work. Like, take a little bit of time off and celebrate it. You did it. So you have your development team, you understand their positions, you've set up a healthy, productive, general environment around them to exist in. Now it's time to talk about the day-to-day and week-to-week steps that you need to take an active interaction with each of them. So let's talk about the very beginning of a new developer's time at your organization. And before a new dev joins Titan, the first thing we want to do is make sure that they have all the physical equipment they need to do with their job. So that starts with a laptop. I've chosen MacBooks for everyone, although we do have a few devs who opt into Linux. We set a general price range for what we expect those laptops are going to cost, but then the developers can ask for different specific configurations of certain things as long as it falls within that price range. And it makes sense that if somebody else is going to have to adopt this laptop, it's not going to be completely crazy configuration. Occasionally, a developer will bring their own machine, and that's fine. We don't require people to maintain a work and a personal computer. I understand why you might want to do that, because, if you fire somebody, you're not going to give them 3 weeks to get all their work off the machine. But we're not in a state where I have to be really stressed around that. Even if I were to fire someone, I would still say, hey, your passwords don't work anymore, but you have a week to get me the machine, get all your personal stuff off. And that's often everything when people first get set up. But occasionally they need help setting up an office that's actually good for their, physical self. They might need an office chair, which we encourage them to buy refurb, or sometimes they need a desk, which we help them buy affordably, or sometimes instead of setting up their personal office at home, we help them with the membership to a co-working space. And because we're not paying for a physical office, I'm not so bothered by the cost of individual co-working spaces or individual, chairs and things. Because if I had a physical office, I would be paying that for everybody, and it would be costing a lot more. On everyone's first day, every dev is scheduled for an onboarding call, and that onboarding call is usually at least 2 calls. There's one with our people operations manager, which is basically our HR, but often they also do a call with some kind of a technical lead, where it's me or it's Keith, our director of engineering, or maybe just one of the technical lead programmers. We get them a copy of our handbook, which I doubt anybody reads the whole way through, although I'm sure I'm not supposed to say that legally. But also we have a programmer's handbook, which is the much more practical, here's how we do code styles, here's what tools we use here to prep. It's sort of like the early version of those, claude.md or cursor.md files that tell an AI how to code. This is a much more robust one that's meant for actual human beings. And I think most people read that one. From there, my top priority is to make sure that they are as in as possible, as early as possible to the day-to-day operations of the company. So we want them to be assigned to a project, even just as a shadow. We want them to be programming so they can kind of see what our coding is like, but they can also build relationships with people who are not in leadership. They want to meet people who are not me, so they can have comfortable, casual spaces to learn on the job and get a sense of what being a Titan developer is really like. I do want to make a quick note about creating an environment for productive development. The majority of the things I think belong in the question of how to manage developers we've already covered in how to set up a healthy developer culture, how to set up an environment for maximum developer productivity, and even how to structure the positions of a dev team. Managing developers is about managing people, and it's about creating an environment and expectations for their flourishing, for their growth, for their productivity. So I would definitely recommend checking out those videos, because I think that managing developers well is more about setting them up for success than it is for building structures and organizations and systems for managing them. That said, there are pieces we can focus on for how to effectively manage our developers. There are some systems that we can build. So first, let's talk about how to track and encourage developers' growth. I wish I was someone who had some really deep and intricate systems for managing my developers' growth, and I could tell you the magic 1, 2, 3 formula, and I don't, but I can tell you what I do. First, I try to make sure I get to know the people who work at Titan, especially when they first start there. I want to get to know them through the application process in those first few weeks. So that means from day one, I have an understanding of where they're coming from and where they're heading, including what motivated them to join Titan in the first place. That often kind of lines up with their career goals. Then twice a year, we check in to ask, among other things, what do you want from your job at Titan going forward, and what are you trying to do with your career? This helps me understand their higher goals. Are they trying to be a lead developer? Do they want to start a product company one day? Are they just focused on learning specific tasks and specific skills right now? At the beginning of the company, I was able to hold weekly one-on-ones with all our devs, but at this point, my one-on-ones are with my senior leadership team, and Keith, our director of engineering, holds one-on-ones with each individual developer. But somewhere, someone in your organization needs to be checking in all the members of your team regularly, probably weekly. And those one-on-ones aren't specifically for the benefit of leadership. They are helpful to understand that the dev is doing well, but they're not to run some specific type of agenda. They're more for creating a space for the developers to be heard, to plan and to express their own goals, and to ask for help. And while one-on-ones are a great opportunity for mentorship, they're not the only one. I would definitely recommend aiming to add other mentorship opportunities, whether formal or casual. For example, having a lead on every single team gives a focus for the people on the team to have someone ask questions of, someone they can look up to, someone that they know is actually kind of looking out intentionally for their growth. But one of the things we also do in one-on-ones is identify people, and in our annual reviews, biannual reviews, is to find people who are explicitly looking for mentoring and find other people who are explicitly looking to offer mentoring and making sure that we pair them up together. And speaking of pairing, even when it's not explicitly a sort of mentory pairing, just any kind of pair programming, even across different projects, is an incredible opportunity for developer growth. And it's not always just the juniors learning from the seniors. It can often be across, ability levels because people have different experiences and different approaches and have tried and experienced something different. Much of the ways that we support our developers' careers happen in the ways that I was just talking about, but there are some other things you can do as well to support their careers. You definitely want to make sure your team has access to all the best learning materials, so books and video courses and conferences and other opportunities to grow. We've got a library of books we purchase and video courses, and everyone on the team has an access to a Laracasts account and attends Laracon every year. And that's great for learning, but we also want to help their careers advance in other ways. So we're going to encourage our developers to speak by holding internal lunch and learns, and we're going to help them apply to meetups and conferences. We're going to encourage them to write by making space for them in the Titan blog, and we're also going to support them and encourage them to stream, to build tools publicly, or do whatever else is interesting to them by giving them 20% time every week to work on things outside of their assigned client work. And those things are all really valuable for the advancement of their careers, both in terms of their development abilities, but also in terms of people seeing what they're doing out there, because people's public reputation is often very valuable for developers' careers. And it's good for us as well to have our developers doing things out there. I mean, we've often had clients come and say, hey, a quarter of the Laracon speakers this year are from Titan, so you guys must be doing something right. It looks great for our clients. But I also just want my developers to succeed. I want them to achieve their goals, and I'm honored to be a part of their stories. And we all get the chance to see these people who we see enough potential in to obviously be a part of our company, of our organization. And so we should also want them to see some benefit other than just a paycheck. Like, how can we help them move further in their careers? And whether it's within our organization or not, it's still an awesome thing to do. I've spent most of this episode, and honestly most of this course, talking about how to make things go well, with the assumption that if you do it right, it always will. But unfortunately, for some reason, things can eventually go south. Very few people never have a problem with one of their employees. So hopefully you've hired well enough that when things go poorly, it's not intentional, but even the best hiring can't save you from some issues at some point. So when you have an issue with the developer, it's best to get the information you need to address it, and then address it head on right away. The longer it takes, the bigger it builds, the more resentment there might be, the more opportunity for miscommunications. If a developer isn't doing their job well, or they did something they shouldn't have, you need to ask around as quietly as possible to as few people as possible to get what you need to learn from a context. And maybe that you don't have to do it all, but either way, directly bringing it up either on their next one-on-one or just take a call right then if it's bad enough. 9 times out of 10, if you have a healthy culture, they'll be honest about it. Sometimes it's something they're aware of and they even agree with. You work together to find a resolution, whether that's a change in their assignment or working together to build support structures for them to grow in this thing. But if it's a big enough issue that if it needs a formal structure around ensuring they grow, or if they respond in a way that makes you worry that they're not taking it seriously, or if you ask them to change this thing before and now they haven't, it's time for a PIP. And a PIP is a performance improvement plan. Now, I know PIPs have a bad reputation on the internet. There's a lot of jaded folks who will tell you, if you got a PIP, it's really just your employer finding a way to excuse firing you a little bit later. And I don't want to say that's not entirely untrue. If you give someone a PIP, there is a baseline note that they have to improve something, and if they don't, they're going to get fired. Yes. But a PIP given in a good spirit is given with the intention that they understand what to change, they change it, they keep working there, you forget it ever happened, and everything's good. So let's talk about what a PIP actually is. It's a set of changes you want to see and a given timeline in which those changes need to happen, usually agreed on together, accompanied by often actions that they should take in those directions, and often intermediate check-in points. So let's say it might be something like, you need to improve in these 2 ways in these 3 months. We're going to check in once a month to make sure you've done it. And here's 4 steps I think you should be able to take that will allow you to do this. So you're not just kind of throwing it on them saying, fix it. You're helping out with that. You build the document together, although obviously you're the primary person building it, but you need to make sure that they can see it, they understand it, they agree to it, and then you check with them regularly and evaluate their progress at the end. And hopefully it goes well, and you forget this ever happened. Now, things are really bad when you have to either fire someone or lay them off. The difference, at least in American terminology, is that firing someone means they're at fault, they're going to leave and you're going to put somebody else usually in their place. Whereas laying somebody off, or I think in other cultures they call it making someone redundant, means the job no longer exists, and as an unfortunate side effect, that means this person does not have a job anymore. But there's a huge difference in the motivation and the implications of both. So first of all, if you lay somebody off, you need to work hard to ease their transition because this is not their fault, right? Give as many weeks as severance pay as you can, reach out to your networks and try to find them a job somewhere else. If you can, offer services like resume coaching, offer them letters of recommendation, because it's not their fault they don't have a job anymore, and sometimes it might even be a little bit your fault, so be considerate. If someone's fired, on the other hand, in theory, it's supposed to be their fault, so you're not really obligated or expected to do any of that unless there's some kind of legal requirements. When they're fired, it's more like a breakup. You want to minimize the likelihood things get even worse, but that's likely best done by having a hard conversation and then cutting off the bleeding. Be ready to remove access to anything vital in case they decide to get upset and break things, and have all your paperwork ready. Because if you've gotten to the point where you have to fire someone, things are really bad. And it might be their fault, it might be yours, it might be both, but regardless, it's bad. So rip off the Band-Aid, regroup on the other side to see what you could have done better, and move on. Okay, let's end on a more positive note. What about when your team is doing especially well? First, they should be hearing about it. It doesn't cost anything to tell them on one-on-ones or their annual reviews or just an everyday conversation that they're doing well. At Titan, we also have a channel in our Slack called Kudos, which a former team member, Marge, created for us with the express purpose of highlighting when somebody does something really well. And it's such a joy to get mentioned in that channel, especially because at that point you always see all the emojis responses to that pile up, and because we're goofs and we have a lot of custom emojis, half of them are just going to be a history of years of custom emojis built with your face in them, you writing a cow or you with a silly hat on or whatever, and it's just a great time to celebrate people for their contributions to the company. And another way to celebrate your team is to go all out when you're together in person. I love our company on-sites. We do it once a year, and one of the reasons is because I get to completely apply my team with swag and food and drink and experiences and whatever else, and it is such an incredible and enjoyable way to use the company's money to thank the people who are an absolutely vital part of that money showing up in the first place. If you have any kind of a public persona, also be sure to share the shine with your team members whenever they get a chance, because usually if you're that person, you kind of have this public space and the rest of the people are just kind of like the people at this team, right? But it's really great to be able to start saying, hey, I was working on this thing and Guillermo helped me with this. I was working on that and Tony helped me with that. I was working with this and Marcy showed me this really cool idea. And it doesn't cost you a thing. And finally, if you can get budget, it's really nice to send little gifts here or there. Maybe it's a pizza party, once a quarter, or it could be the gift that you give at the 5-year mark or the end of your bonus, whatever you have pull to do to let people know that they're really appreciated. And there's a ton more that goes into managing developers. This could be an entire series on its own, but between this and some of the earlier videos about creating healthy development cultures, I hope you've got enough to get started. One of the best tools we have for building a productive development team is setting up their optimum environment and process for the coding aspect of their job. Now, we've already talked about meetings and flow state, minimizing interruptions, and other higher-level environmental ideas that help your team feel safe and supported at work. But now let's talk about code, version control, workflows and code processes, and more. The goal of any development process or setup that we come up with is to enable developers to write and deploy good code. That's it. And if a process isn't enabling this, or worse, if it is detracting from this happening, it's not a good process, and that's it. You can evaluate everything against that. And there's a ton of common examples for processes that purportedly help us out, but are actually harming the ability for developers to write and deploy good code. Usually things that serve the business's micromanagement and need to control everything at the expense of actual productivity. Things like excessive stand-ups, I would say even daily stand-ups, planning meetings with 20 people for a single feature, having to attach your commits to every single Jira ticket, excessive time tracking requirements, and then more. If we focus instead on enabling individuals and small teams to quickly build out small pieces of code, test and deploy them, ship it to production, and then just do that over and over and over again, iteratively until we're done, That is the way we are creating systems that are most effective towards our teams, our companies, our organizations, to deliver value to the end user. So let's talk about some tools, systems, and processes that will enable our developers to build and ship great code. First off, Git. If you're not using Git yet, you will be absolutely gobsmacked by how much it improves your workflows. And this is not true just for larger teams, it's even true for an individual. And this is true about all version control. Git is just emblematic of version control these days because it's the best out there. But I do want to say specifically that Git is by far the most flexible, most capable, and most supported version control system out there. There's no reason to use anything else, and there's no comparison. And if you're an old head, you might have familiarity using older version control systems that got bigger and bulkier the more work that you had. If you lost connection with your external system, you were stuck because you didn't have a local copy. None of that is true with Git. You have a local copy of everything up and running. It's super light. It's only storing the diffs. It's the best out there. If you've never tried it, you gotta give Git a chance. I couldn't imagine writing code without Git today. Now, if you work with Git, you do have to choose some kind of a centralized host to have any kind of modern development tooling. And people may hate me for this, but I'm just gonna say it straight out. There is only one reasonable choice when it comes to a centralized Git host, and that is GitHub. Now, Bitbucket is one of its biggest competitors. It's run by Atlassian, who makes Jira, and I think that's literally the only reason anybody uses Bitbucket is because they like Jira, which is a problem in itself. But regardless of whether or not you're on Jira, Bitbucket is pure garbage. Don't touch it. The other primary competitor is GitLab, which has some things to offer, some things going for it, but it doesn't come close to GitHub when it comes to building out the user experience and developer experience for modern productive development teams. The few dollars you save by using anything other than GitHub is completely burned by the amount of extra work you have to do by choosing to use a subpar tool. And if you're saying, oh, well, that's really nice for you to say, but give us some examples, I could do an entire video just about this. But for starters, just compare the pull request workflow between all the different tools. For starters, GitHub actually invented the modern pull requests we know about today. Prior to that, there was a concept called request pull, which was very manual. It didn't look at all what we're looking at. So the actual pull request, first of all, is a GitHub invention. And second of all, GitLab and Bitbucket have done poor at best jobs of mimicking their work. All the while, GitHub was slowly but consistently refining the experience and the feature to be better every year. Okay, so your code base is on Git, preferably using GitHub. Now what's the best branching strategy? That's usually one of the first questions you get asked. There's a lot of different popular strategies. There's Git Flow, there's GitHub Flow, and there's lots of others. But here's what we prefer at Titan at minimum, and we've used this across hundreds of code bases, and I'm really big fan of it. So for starters, you have your main branch, which holds the kind of core identity of like, this is what our application actually is. And later we'll talk about this, but it should be the thing that automatically deploys to production in your CD workflow. Then you have a develop branch or staging, whatever you want to call it, that is the active under development, should be working in general, but this is where we're kind of moving fast, breaking things kind of work. And that should, again, automatically deploy to staging. From the develop branch, you want to make feature branches. And these are basically individual features that should last for days to maybe weeks. If you want to, you can do individual staging environments per feature branch, or just do one staging environment on staging or develop, whatever you want. That's totally up to your team configuration. But eventually you're going to get to the point where you merge those feature branches back into your development branch. And then merging that develop branch to main is how you push from staging to prod. If you need hotfixes, those are going to come off the main branch. And so you're going to do a little hotfix branch right off the main branch. You're going to hotfix it, and you're going to merge that back into main and then into develop, either by merging the hotfix branch into both, or by merging the hotfix into main and then merging main up to develop. It is similar to GitHub Flow, but it's just a little bit simpler, and GitHub Flow is simpler than Git Flow. Most teams don't need Git Flow or even GitHub Flow level of complexity. And so with this, you have a really great default that you can start from, and you can modify this on a team basis or on a project by project basis if you have specific needs that aren't well addressed by the system. But I can tell you right now, this is a really solid base that covers the vast majority of teams and projects. All right, so we've got our Git branching set up. What about good Git commits? This is something I see very few companies implementing, other than if they're requiring you to attach your Git commits to Jira tickets, which I'm not a big fan of. But I do think that good commits are very helpful for understanding a code base, especially after the fact. So a good Git commit contains a single kind of piece of work that's done. And we can talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the git commit messages contain almost an instruction on what this thing does. And if you look at the commits that Git generates by default, they're all in the imperative tense. They're not, I did this thing. They are, do that thing. So you can look at your history of Git commits as basically like a set of instructions. And if you open up any individual item in the instruction, then it tells you the what and the how, but the list is just do this, then do this, then do that. That's kind of how we want to build ours as well. They should be things maybe like add or write column to the dashboard or allow users to log in with GitHub OAuth. And there's a little movement of people in our section of the world who just want to write WIP or work in progress for all their commits. And that's fine, as long as no one ever needs to look back at your code history to figure out why something happened or when it happened. And the thing is, when you're thinking about that future person, it might be you, or it might be another developer, or it might be someone who wants to buy your tool or is considering it in the future. So even if you don't need those commits today, imagine what you might need in the future. And I would make the argument that, unfortunately, even though I have written a WIP commit or two here or there, it's really worth avoiding them and taking time to write good commit messages. So like I was saying, I think the best commit you can do is large enough that it contains a meaningful moderation to the functionality of the code base. So it's not, change 2 lines of code that don't actually, like those 2 lines don't do anything unless you do other things. It should actually kind of be as of a whole, even though the tests don't necessarily have to pass for every single commit. It doesn't have to be large enough for that. But it should be meaningful, right? But it should be small enough that you wouldn't ever want to roll just part of that commit back. And that's kind of my internal rule is even if it's, maybe we're rolling back only a little bit of this feature, but we need to roll back this one particular implementation choice, hopefully that whole rollback will be one commit, not just part of a commit. And it's not a huge deal, like Git allows you to do these partial changes, but it's just kind of the guideline I use for figuring out the size of them. I would mention that a lot of older school Git users lean towards larger commits where they're doing one full feature per commit. And if you work that way, that's fine. I personally like commits that are distinct pieces of a whole, and then the pull request kind of pulls together that whole. For a great read on how to write a Git commit message, check out the article by the name on Chris Beam's website, How to Write a Git Commit Message. It's a lot of great stuff that I pulled a little bit of this from and can teach you more about what a good commit message looks like. I mentioned already that GitHub introduced the modern pull request, but the concept of request pull has been around since before Git even existed. Basically, in either of them, you're asking, hey, can you take a look at this modification I made to the existing code? Now, PRs are a fantastic way to organize your code into distinct change sets, to document the changes, and to facilitate code review. All the code your company writes should be looked at least twice before going live. And when I talk about it, I call this 4 eyes, meaning either 2 people pair programming or 1 person coding and the other person reviewing. But pull requests don't just facilitate other people reviewing code, they also facilitate you reading your own code again before you actually commit it. So good PR is going to describe what the code is and what it does, often with graphical elements or animations, but it also gives your team and yourself space to review implementation before they go live. Similar to the article I referenced before, there's a really great post titled Building a Pull Request, this time on the Titan blog, and I definitely recommend you check it out for some of the things I think are vital for understanding how to build a good pull request. But essentially with the pull request, we're introducing a set of changes that can be merged without breaking the application. And like I said before, not every commit can necessarily be merged without breaking some things, although that's ideal, but every pull request should be a distinct piece of work that can be described, that can be evaluated, and that can be applied without your app breaking. And with most Git branching standards, a pull request also signals the end of a short-lived feature branch, which helps us avoid the painful situation of long-lived feature branches that slowly diverge from develop, making the eventual merge more and more painful by the day. So my kind of general rule for pull requests is that you want them to stay open for days, not weeks, and contain dozens or less commits, not hundreds. And those are kind of arbitrary rules. It's not always possible, but the bigger and the longer running that pull request is, the harder it's going to be to get it merged. And that is not a good state to be in because it's going to get harder and harder and less likely. And these things just kind of build on top of each other until you're an absolute mess and you can't deploy anything. We'll talk in a minute about how to set up the deploy tooling you can use to deploy your site once your PRs are merged. But before we do so, several pieces of that tooling rely on us choosing your development and engineering standards ahead of time. You're definitely going to want to establish some kind of a coding standard and as many engineering standards as you can right off the bat, so you can avoid a concept called bike shedding, which is wasting time going back and forth about where the braces go, or tabs versus spaces, or styles of architecture, or preferred package for this, rather than actually building useful code for actual users. At minimum, every dev team should have a defined set of core coding standards for their backend language, their framework, and their core JavaScript framework if they're using one. For Laravel teams, you can stick with Pint out of the box, or at Titan, we actually have a tool called Duster that includes Pint and a few other tools and configures them all to work together to form a sort of kind of mega linter. Out of the box, it's using Titan's coding standards that we have defined over years, but you can also create a Duster config file to have your own linting, whether for your team or for your specific repo. Once you've chosen a standard, whether you're using our tooling or not, you're going to expect your devs to learn that standard, they're going to use it, and they're going to build it into their both local and remote tool stack. So you shouldn't see your senior developers wasting time linting code and pull requests, because the coding standards will all already have been defined, and they'll show what that code should look like from a minor perspective, right? It's not going to be the full implementation details, but it's going to be at least, where the braces go and all those things. And your developers should understand it and write it. Their local setups should ensure that it gets written that way. And then your CI/CD will also catch anything that slips by the devs long before it actually gets to individuals doing code review. And finally, this brings us to the shared third-party SaaS services you should set up on every project. So first, we want to make it easy as possible to push to staging and to prod. Both of those should happen preferably just by a commit to a specific branch. So we're going to need to set up a staging server that is close as possible to the prod server, and then automate deploys preferably to both based on commits to their respective branches. Remember I said that I think that main should pair together with prod, develop should pair together with staging. So at Titan, we use Laravel's tools Forge and Envoyer and now Cloud for this, but you can use whatever you like as long as it does not require a manual push to deploy. You want to avoid that as much as possible. You're probably aware of this concept. It's often called CI/CD, and that is continuous integration and continuous deploy. CI means that certain functions that are not deploy related are run when you push code, usually running your tests, linting your code, maybe building something. And then CD means that your code is deployed when pushed to a certain branch or when a certain trigger is run. And both of those automate core DevOps tasks and significantly diminish the cost of the steps between writing code and it going live on the internet. And you should be doing that as often as possible. Your production site should, if at all possible, aim to deploy once a week at minimum. The longer you go between deploys, the bigger the cost, and then the bigger the risk is every single time you deploy. There's two other third-party services I want you to consider that would really beneficial to have, preferably on any staging and production sites. First, you want to sign up for an exception tracking service and pipe its notifications into a shared channel in a tool like Slack. Make sure everybody sees those issues and it happens on all of your servers. Install this on staging and prod. And second, I would recommend considering a centralized mailbox. Mail is one of the hardest things to test on staging, and there's tools like Mailtrap that make it easier for you to preview staging emails in a real-looking mail client. You can also then make those emails accessible to non-technical team members and to your clients. There's just one last thing I want to share about how to help you build productive coding processes, and that's the concept of paper cuts. So paper cuts are any minor annoyances that on their own aren't that bad, but when you look at the sum of their accumulated impact over time, end up actually having a very large impact on your development and your developers' happiness. So the first paper cut that I see very commonly is slow tests. If your local test suite takes more than a minute to run on someone's local machine, it's just not going to get run. Ideally, your team can be running their tests after every significant change they make, but even if they have to get stuck running only a smaller subset of their tests on a regular basis, they'll still have to run that full suite every time they push code. And if it takes 8 minutes, you're not just losing 8 minutes, you're actually losing 15 or 20 minutes before they get back on the workflow every single time they run their tests, which means they're either going to be extremely distracted or they're not going to run the tests very often. And both of those are big problems. And this is a paper cut not just for local development, but for CI/CD as well. You do have more time there because usually when somebody's pushing code, they don't have to just sit there in front of the CI waiting for it to pass. But that's not always true. Sometimes you need CI to clear before you can make sure a PR is ready, or you need CD to finish so you can get that urgent bug that you just fixed actually live. You don't want to wait an hour in either of those scenarios. Another paper cut is long-running pull requests. And we already covered why it's valuable to merge PRs quickly, but I just want to throw in here that long-lived PRs and long-running branches are two huge and extremely common paper cuts that you should save your team from because they're wasting hours cumulatively, even over the span of weeks, if you have those things running longer than they need to. And finally, out-of-date dependencies. We'll talk more later about how important it is to prioritize addressing technical debt and what it looks like to kind of vie for that in your organization. But I just want to mention here that out-of-dependencies are a huge paper cut, not just because you have security concerns that come from it, but also you can't use the latest features. You always have to be figuring out which version of the docs you're in. You often have to do extra coding work to bridge between the version you have and what is necessary to work with some other system. And often if you do want a particular thing that's not there, you know it exists, you know it's coming, and so now you have to build these short-lived systems that do the work now, which cost, and then also remember to remove them later, which costs. You might be wondering how we've gotten to the end of this video and I haven't talked about AI at all, but I'm just going to say it's not worth recording a long section here about AI because by the time this video is released, it'll all be different. AI is great for rote work. It's great for junior developer stuff. If you're happy to sit down and give something explicit directions and then review its work, it's a great tool, just like a junior developer can be a useful thing. So I actually like using AI for building templates and doing other stuff where I know exactly how to do it. I just don't feel like typing, right? Sometimes it can just save me a little bit of time in doing rote work, and that's fine. But AI is no replacement for real creative development thought. And it's really important for me to say that, especially to you as folks who are talking about leading development teams. You can't replace a developer with AI. Now, you may be able to get the benefit a junior developer would have added. You might be able to speed up other developers by wasting less of their time using AI, but it does not replace the need for an actual developer in the first place. And I just want to note, AI brings with it a real concern for the environment that we as an industry have just kind of casually shrugged off, and we're not going to be able to do that forever. So, like every tool, it can be useful, but it brings with it costs, both to our development workflow and in this case, to our world, and we just have to figure out when is the right time to use it or not. Obviously, there are concerns that we may not have talked about that are specific to your tech stack, to your team's abilities, to the specifics of your niche of the industry, but hopefully this gets you some baseline standards for how to get your coders ready to write great code. All right, so here's something that I say in every single meeting with every single potential client we have at Titan. It's a little weird saying it here, but whatever, it's fine. What we do at Titan in terms of our development workflow is we pick up the most important week of work that can possibly be done for you, and then we do the best job we can of doing that. And then we deliver it to you, and when you're ready, we ship, and then we do that same process over and over and over again until you're happy with the outcome. That's our development methodology. And there's tons of other development methodologies that are worth considering. I want to name specifically that we've used Basecamp's ShapeUp before for some clients, and we had a really good time with it, so I want to honor those. But I don't want to honor all other ways of doing development. Actually, the vast majority of development methodologies that I've seen are things that I think are particularly damaging to the likelihood of any work actually getting done because they serve leadership, not actual development happening. And we can talk about that in a little bit. But I do want to say of all the different development methodologies that I've tried, of ways to figure out tasking and who's working on what when, I've never been unhappy with this simple weekly cadence we've come up with. So let's get started by talking about what our cadence is for meetings with the client, because a lot of these systems structure things around sprint retrospectives or plannings or anything like that. Once a week, we meet up with the client and we say, here's what we did last week, see if they have any notes about it and any feedback. We say, here's what we're going to do next week, and we can ask them any questions we have, or they can give us any notes to make sure that we're going to do it according to their goals. And then that's really it for the meeting. And in between meetings, we only meet internally if necessary. Every once in a while, it's a quick meeting to show the PM something, but it's usually just pair programming sessions are the main meetings that happen. But we don't have daily stand-ups, we don't have sprint retrospectives or planning sessions, but literally just these weekly check-ins handle all of those functions, and it works great for us. There are a decent number of clients that will give at the end of every single day a written update, just says, here's what I worked on, quick bullet points. And some clients, especially more technical clients, will ask for pairing sessions with our developers or planning sessions with our PM. So there are opportunities for other meetings, but at the core, the actual kind of tasking system is based around the single weekly meeting, everybody together in one place, recapping the previous week's work and planning the next. For years, I've been talking on the internet about what I call lowercase a agile, which is just the delineation between agile as an adjective, we move in a way that is agile, versus agile, which is a formal structure. The Agile Manifesto, notice Agile, not Agile Manifesto, was a document, and it talked about how we can work with agility, how we can be agile, which is literally just an adjective that means able to move quickly, able to move easily, able to change directions quickly. And since then, an entire world, an entire consulting ecosystem has developed, co-opting some of the ideas and a lot of the language of Agile. And it's called Agile. But I don't actually believe in Agile. I don't believe in Scrum. I think the entire Agile industrial complex is a scam. And I have never once in my career seen a team become more effective in defining and delivering tasks and value in working software because they switched to Agile. I have seen it go the opposite direction. They switch to Agile because things are wrong and they get more wrong, and now there's more money in the pockets of consultants. However, I think the Agile Manifesto and the idea of agility in the first place is the most brilliant thing that's ever happened to development team featured definition and delivery. If you haven't read the Agile Manifesto, it's super short. It's 12 points. And I definitely recommend you check it out. I would love to cover the whole thing here, but once again, I don't have time. But if you're looking for some spice in your version of that, check out the more modern work of somebody named Alan Holub, who really kind of takes it a little bit further. The manifesto itself, though, has 12 principles behind it. And if you read them, you will hear echoes of many of those points in this course and not just in this video. For this particular episode, there's 2 points that are really key, and it's the first two. Early and continuous delivery of valuable software, unbothered by changing requirements. And that's not how they word it, but those are kind of their general ideas. And every aspect of my ideal tasking system wants to enable those things to happen. And now I'm going to introduce you to my ideal development workflow, at least as I have access to right now, Kanban. Kanban is a way of visualizing tasks created by Toyota, I think in the 60s, and inspired from their perspective by how supermarkets, namely Piggly Wiggly in the US, handle stocking. The goals of Kanban are to make it easy to visualize work that needs to be done and track its movement through the various stages of progression, or for our sake, for the various stages of development. So it can be used for lots of purposes, but I think it's especially well suited for software development. There are a lot of different tools that you can use to implement Kanban. A lot of folks add Kanban after the fact. You can start simple with something like Trello. You can become inordinately difficult to deal with like Jira, or new and sexy like Linear. But I'd recommend if you're getting started and you're not attached to a tool, Trello is simple and proven, and it's a great place to start. So with Kanban, you can change what your columns are based on the project or based on how you work, but I'd recommend at least ideologically starting with 4: to do, doing, ready for review, and done. Cards, which represent tasks, start on the left and move right until they're done. And within each column, the top to bottom order can mean many things, but very often it represents priority or sometimes time. So on our weekly meetings with the client, we take a look at the to-do column and we make sure there's at least what feels like around a week worth of work in that column, and that those cards in that week worth of work all make sense enough that we can actually implement them right now without further meetings with the client. We also make sure that the top priority work that the client wants done is at the top of that list, and then we pull those until they're done. But unlike Scrum and a lot of other agile sprint-based systems, Kanban is never locked. If we've pulled a card and we need to change our priority or focus midweek, we just do. If we reach the end of the week and we've run out of work, we just pull another card. Or if we reach the end of the week and a card that we're working on is not done, we just don't finish it. It's not a big deal, and we're not structuring things around the expectations of the sprint. And I make this reference all the time, and I'll make it again here. People are not made for systems. We don't work long hours trying to cram a task in before the weekly meeting, or twiddle our thumbs at the end of a sprint because, God forbid, we start something at the end of the week we're not confident we can finish within the week. That's a dumb way of working, and it's not actually productive. Systems are made for us to be productive, and they should bend and flex for us when necessary so we can stay productive. And just like with code-based processes, these task processes exist to support developers writing and shipping good code, not supporting them getting their velocity aligned with the number of commits to match some t-shirt size planning poker estimate they made 2 weeks ago when they barely comprehended this task. So let's say you've agreed with me, you know that Kanban is a way to go, and now you need to figure out what does it look like to define a task in an actual card in your Kanban. Well, you want to define as minimally as possible, I would say bare minimum a sentence fragment, what it would look like for somebody who does not understand this task to know enough to do it. You could say something like add user login, and the more likely it is that that's going to be misunderstood by the developer, the more you need to explain. For example, you could write allow users to log in with GitHub, and that's actually a decent card in some settings and not in others. It requires the developer to figure out where the GitHub button should go, how to handle it if the user's GitHub provided email already exists in the database as a normal user. If you're not using Laravel, you might have to figure out what tooling do we want to use for this, and on and on. And that could be fine. If you have independent developers, my favorite, who can make these sort of choices, and a client or product owner who's fine for them to do so, also my favorite, then allow users to log in with GitHub is a perfectly well-defined task. But if not, if you know that your client or business team is going to be mega picky, or if they need to run everything through the designer first, or if this particular developer is not yet capable of making these sorts of decisions on the fly, to get this card to a point where it's fleshed out in a way that it is defined the must-haves. Like if it must look this way, then it's there. If it must have a particular workflow, it's there. But again, keep it as minimal as possible. And then at that point, the dev is capable of picking it up. You will not be surprised to hear me say this, but I highly recommend keeping your cards as simple as possible. And I would much prefer a card that says allow users to log in with GitHub and then freedom to do what makes the most sense over an extremely complicated one with 4 pages of spec. But that's not always possible, so you do what you can. More often than not, your tasks will come from your client or your product owner as large, ill-defined features complete with unhelpful prescriptions on how to solve the problem, which is your domain, but not enough information about why or to what end, which should be their domain. The goal of a project manager or process lead is to work together with business to flesh out those non-technical aspects of the feature spec to make it clear how it should work and why. And then they're going to work together with the technical lead to split that up from a sense of what makes sense to split up from a technical perspective. Because sometimes feature splits don't always line up the same as technical splits. You get the two together and they'll find the best kind of scenario, the best solution for that. And then what that means you're going to end up with is features that span many cards. Often a card is just one task that's one piece of a larger feature. And so you can imagine your feature might be something like add social auth. Well, it turns out what we need to do is a card for setting up the area for those social auth buttons to go in. They might have a card for every single social auth provider that we're going to add. And then maybe later we're going to add a card that says, oops, we didn't expect that GitHub would allow you to social auth without having an email address back. And so we need to add auth logic for that to actually work in our application. You're splitting up these tasks into the smallest unit of useful change that a client can approve if it's a feature, or another developer can approve if it's a purely technical task. And obviously, the smallest amount you can approve is a pretty arbitrary measure, but I would just say if you're unsure, always err on the side of smaller tasks. There's very little cost that comes from completing 4 tasks in a day, but there's a lot of cost that comes from completing only 1 task every 2 weeks. So if you're not sure, keep them small. As such, the ideal cards on a Kanban board can be done in hours or days, not weeks or months. If your card takes more than a week, it's more than 1 card, but that's fine. First of all, this is a learning process. And second of all, you might learn that a day or 2 in, you can split out the task between multiple cards midway. That's actually one of the big beauties of Kanban is that you don't have to do it perfect at first. You do the best with what you have, but then the longer you've worked on the project or feature or even task, the more you'll know. And as you know more, you update the Kanban card or the Kanban board. And sometimes those updates mean we have to take a task that we thought would take a certain amount of time and then split it out into multiple tasks, and sometimes it makes it larger and longer. That just means we need to have a conversation about what that means to our team. Should we cut some of the subtasks? Should we push them to another phase? Do we just need to communicate that we're going to deliver later than we expected? These are all reasonable options, But in order to see them as options and know which to take, you have to split everything out into different cards first. So as I've already said, I prefer simply defined tasks that give the developer the ability to do what makes the most sense to them. I don't hire people without any real-world experience. We're looking for empathetic, considerate people who want to understand the customer and build what actually makes the most sense for them. And these people are therefore uniquely positioned to combine their expertise in programming, so in solving problems, with their understanding of the need in order to make the best final outcome that anybody could make. So I'm looking to give developers reasonably fleshed out tasks with immediate access to business or client or product owner, whatever, for clarification, and then leeway to make the best choice that they can figure out. And we have other developers and PMs looking at all the work they do, so it's not like anyone's going to go rogue and commit something to the client that we don't believe in. So this is a really safe option. If you've ever read Ender's Game, I just finished reading it with my son for the umpteenth time. There's a classic way at Battle School for building armies. The leadership tells everybody exactly what to do, but then when the battle gets going, they're all left waiting for input for the leaders, and then they're overwhelmed and they don't get any feedback, so they're kind of useless. But then there's the Ender way of building armies, where he builds small groups led by empowered leaders who do understand his overall goals and check in occasionally, but they have agency and practice to do what makes the most sense in the moment. So as development managers, I want us to be more like Ender. I've mentioned pair programming a few times throughout this course, but I haven't talked a ton about it. There's not really a ton to pair programming effectively. There are more complex forms, and if you read anything from the extreme programming folks, you'll probably see there's a very right and wrong way to do it according to some folks. But for me, pair programming is just two people working on the same code on the same screen. It doesn't even have to be the same physical screen. I think we've proven that remote pair programming works just fine. Usually one person is driving, which means they have the keyboard and the mouse, and the other person is taking more of like a high-level look. They're reviewing code, they're maybe looking up ideas and syntax and requirements, they might be making longer-term plans. And the driver can and should change throughout the pair session, so sometimes you're driving and sometimes you're planning. At Titan, we just use Zoom for pairing because we already use it for business stuff, but there's also a tool called Tuple, built specifically for pairing, that's also very popular. I put this section in the episode about task process because the idea that two developers are working on the same task at the same time can often be scary from a tasking perspective. Like, doesn't that mean they're just going to be half as fast? But in the end, healthy pair programming is an opportunity to effectively build coding and code review into the same step, even also some planning. You have two full brains worth of insight and two full brains worth of experience working on the same task at the same time, and you usually find that your team doesn't want to pair on all tasks, but a specific set of tasks that match their own internal criteria that make the most sense for them to pair on. And the tasks that they want to pair on are usually the tasks that they'd get slowed down on or have to do more planning on or ask for more review on anyway, and they'd end up reaching for help anyway. Don't worry that pair programming is going to mess up your tasking or your pace, as long as you have responsible developers working on it. So there are many much more complicated systems and tools and processes you can use from what I talked about here. You could use Jira. You could have used Pivotal Tracker in the past, although they're RIP now. You could use Scrum. You can use ShapeUp. In the end, you're going to have to figure out what makes the most sense for your team, but pick something and stick to it for sure. But I will tell you right now that the temptation that most people in leadership positions have is to be too structured, too formal, too micromanaging, not the opposite direction. So whatever you do, I would just say, please start as simple as you can. Only add complexity when it's actually necessary. And ensure that when you're adding something, you're doing it because you actually have proof it's going to benefit the team versus it's just what people do. Because if I see one more company that in the absence of knowing how to run a dev team well, just chooses to go all out in Scrum and Jira, save my blood pressure, please. Keep it simple. You might be surprised that this video is one of the topics that I'm covering. Honestly, I'm a little surprised because it's not a topic that is often covered, but it is so important that it's worth trying, even though I don't know exactly how it's going to go. I have often seen problematic, difficult relationships between the engineering side of the organization and the rest of the organization end up completely demoralizing developers and completely diminishing their productivity. And this problem is like a cancer. All the best leadership you can possibly do inside of your engineering team, all the best organizations and structures, none of it matters if you can't fix this core problem. And also, by the way, in this episode, I'm saying engineering a lot in place of development because more often than not, all other engineering considerations like IT and UAT or testing are lumped together with development on one side of these conflicts. Now, there are some ways that issues between engineering and the rest of the organization present pretty consistently across different types of organizations, but there are also some groupings where there are certain types of issues that happen in this context that are specific to a particular type of organization. And this is not a perfect grouping, it's really just based on my personal experience. But in my experience, there's about 5 groups that I think have their own unique ways of experiencing these sorts of problems. And those 5 groups are nonprofits, marketing agencies, development agencies, tech startups, and then basically everybody else. And we will start with the issues that are consistent across all organizations, and then we'll talk about some unique issues about each specifically. But first, I found that many of the more universal dynamics we're going to talk about aren't present at all nonprofits. And that's not to say that nonprofits don't have issues or that none of them have these universal issues, but just that working as a programmer at a nonprofit often presents a unique set of challenges. And I just want to give you 2 small examples. With smaller nonprofits, you're super commonly the superhero who does absolutely everything from front end to back end to mobile work to fixing the printers. If it's tech related, we expect you to fix it. And this very commonly leads to burnout or devs leaving because they don't get paid enough for this. And sometimes this is all just because nonprofits have sort of an all hands on deck mentality. Sometimes it's because they have unrealistic expectations from the very beginning, but sometimes that first programmer that they hired was a jack of all trades who was, a little bit of programmer and a lot of other things, and that was fine. But that person left, and then they said, well, we need to hire another programmer. And so they hired for a normal developer expecting to get another jack of all trades and just didn't know how big their expectations were. With larger nonprofits, they're more likely to be corporate, so they could have more overlaps with some of the examples we'll talk about later. But I also found that a lot of medium to large size nonprofits are the most the most likely to use guilt and pressure to expect unrealistic things from you. They often have this hook that it's all about mission, and they try to use that hook to get you to work for, beyond what is actually reasonable. Kind of, now that I think about it, it's kind of like a lot of toxic startups, basically. And then there's some nonprofits that are just the absolute dream, right? No pressure to deliver on unrealistic expectations, an eye towards your long-term growth and overall peace and health. And I've seen this often at public institutions like colleges. Unfortunately, I have worked with nonprofits, I've worked in nonprofits, but I am not the most experienced person in terms of thinking about nonprofit leadership, about how to solve these problems and issues there, or even how to find those ideal kind of unicorn type nonprofits. But I would say that if you are in technical leadership in a nonprofit, be sure to look at what is reasonable anywhere, not just at your job, but anywhere, to ask a developer to do, and try to shield your team from unrealistic outside expectations outside of that, or pressures to do more than what is actually healthy for them. Okay, so we covered nonprofits. Let's go back to the shared issues I see across different types of companies. I think there are 3 big categories of issue that I commonly see. First, that the things that matter to engineering aren't prioritized at an organizational level. And this might be things like taking time off from feature development to address technical debt. It might be about minimizing meetings to focus on flow state or whatever else. The engineering team is asking for things and they're not given importance. The second is that engineering is committed to timelines, timetables, deliverables that they didn't actually have a say in planning, and little chance to give any feedback on it once that actually happens. And third is when the business is not getting the pace of feature delivery that they want from engineering, they push for more and more micromanagement, focusing on quantity of output over quality. And I don't have all the answers for all of these, but I can tell you that there are 2 common sources of these issues. The first source is that members of the engineering team are seen as a bunch of neckbeard nerds who don't understand what's important and don't care about working on the things that matter to users or the company. They just want to work on shiny nerd passions, basically. I wish I could say this was an entirely unfounded caricature, but we all know it's not. This actually does happen. The problem is, whether it's coming from other folks' real experience in the past with other developers, or the behavior of your developers, or it's just a completely unfounded bias and caricature, this idea spreads. And more, the people who rely on developers to build things, they start seeing them as a group of stubborn, selfish, petulant children who need to be micromanaged in order to get them to do anything useful. And then the number 2 source is, development is seen as more of a trade, like building a shed or installing a toilet, than a creative discipline. It's seen as a set of tasks that can be done over and over again, the full scope of which you probably learned in your initial training. So you learned how to install a toilet, great, now you know how to install any toilet, and you know exactly what it's going to take and how long it's going to take. There are valuable and honorable aspects of being compared to the trades, 100%, but it does start to really break down when that leads to others assuming things about the work of development and, more importantly, the planning of development that aren't actually true in our contexts. So make sure you check out my video later about estimation, which I think will speak to this a little bit more. Okay, so we have identified what might be some of the core issues between your engineering team and the rest of the company. What does it look like for us to solve them? If they can be solved at your organization, which is not always the case, they're usually going to have to be solved by the engineering leadership team, which I hope is you. So if development, for example, is misunderstood as a rote task, you can take on the responsibility of educating the rest of the leadership or the rest of the company on what development really looks like. Bring them along to a planning session with your development team, or help them solve a particularly complex challenge together, and help them see, both by the examples you're showing, then also your explicit communication, how custom application development is effectively the creation of something new that has never existed before. This is an artistic, a magical kind of process, and we want them to see the art and the magic in what we're doing. And if your team isn't doing art and magic, then the issue may be less about their misunderstanding of how you work and more about maybe that's just what development at your company looks like. And I don't mean to be disrespectful, but if your developers, if this is especially true if they're offshore, can't complete a task unless it's been spec'd out in every single detail, then this problem you're having might actually just be a part of the deal with you made with the devil by hiring butts and seats programmers, probably for the cheapest rate you can possibly get. And this same solution applies if you have the other problem, and your team are seen as neckbeards who want to spend their time adding final before all their classes instead of actually doing something productive. If you got a team of bike-shedding neckbeards or a gaggle of useless juniors, the rest of the company may see them as in need of micromanaging because maybe they are actually in need of micromanaging. And at this point, it's clear that you want that not to be the case. So what does it look like for you to engage your developers in the mission of the organization? What does it look like to take them through the definition of some new task in a way that helps them understand their connection to serving real human beings, not just code nerdery? Or is that even possible given who you have currently working for you? If not, there are potentially some hard questions for you to be asking in the future. But if you have the well-rounded, empathetic, capable developers we've been talking about throughout the entirety of this course, then your communication has to make that clear to the rest of the organization. It's not a matter of fixing them, it's a matter of just fixing everybody else's understanding about them. And one way you can do that is you can acknowledge developers' overall tendency towards things like shiny object syndrome. So you can point to things that you've done to try and battle that kind of stuff, but then you use that acknowledgement of criticism to then turn around and say, but these other aspects of what we need are legitimate. And this might be about approval to pay down technical debt or getting budget for attending conferences or whatever else. But now is the time to show the value of those things that you're asking for in a way that makes sense to the non-engineering folks. Talk about the potential costs of the company if technical debt goes unpaid long enough, or share the upsides of devs' ongoing growth as developers. Speak their language, but in doing so, advocate for your team. So let's get to talking about the issues specific to particular types of organizations. First off is marketing agencies. And there's only really one main issue that I've noticed that are relatively consistent and relatively unique to marketing agencies, and that's these firms are most commonly run by people with no development background. If anything, they're most likely designers, but that's not even always the case, but they're very frequently people who've done some form of consulting or agency work, so they understand that piece, but they're not developers, so they don't understand that piece. And they very, very often think of development as purely a end stage implementation detail. Like once we've finished the real creative work, the artistry, I guess we have to hire someone who can translate our vision into dirty, gritty reality, right? And so while the source of this one is different, it's about the leadership being designers, the solution is still the same. Look at your team. Are you doing creative work? If so, make it clear to leadership. Tell the story to them about how what you're doing is just as creative. And if not, then either change it, change the way that you're approaching your work and try to get people to have more of a creative, empathetic understanding. Or if you can't do that or you don't want to do that, then accept your fate that you will always be seen as the implementers, and that's just your lot in life at this company, at least, Okay, moving on to development agencies. I run a development agency, so I'm very likely blind to what goes wrong here, especially in my own organization. But if I had to guess and think about my experiences running my company, I would guess that the worst tendency in agencies like mine is for the salespeople to make promises that the devs have to keep. And I'm really scared that one day this is going to be me. I'm on business development calls all the time, making promises about what we can do in a general sense of what it's going to cost or how long it's going to take. And I'm just afraid that one day I'm going to learn that Titan devs sit around and grumble and gnash their teeth about Matt's unrealistic expectations he sets with clients. So what does it look like to fix this? Well, make sure that your sales folks are in tune with the developers as much as possible, listening and asking them about how are these projects going. Make sure to do retrospectives after projects to say, what was that like for you? What could we have done better to set you up for more success? And also just make sure that they know that even if it's not a specific ask, they can speak up if they're ever concerned about being overcommitted, and make sure that they know that if they do speak up, they're going to be hard. And second, maybe start bringing developers who still code daily along on your sales calls. Get their insight into the proposals you're making, get their eyes on this work before it's signed to see if they can start giving you kind of a fresh understanding of, what the situation is. There is so much wrong with so many tech startups, I can't even begin to describe where the most common problems arise. But when it comes to the relationship between the engineering department at a tech startup and the rest of the startup, I would say the most common issues stem from the way that founders are often drawn to the novel. So you think developers have shiny object syndrome? Try talking to startup founders. And this may come across in constant changes in scope or poor definition of features, or it might be in inappropriate requirements to use whatever the latest hot technology is, even when it's not a good fit. Throw AI in everything, right? Solving this issue requires a bit of leading up, because I assume that you're not the founder. I mean, if you are, great, do better if you have this problem. But assuming you're leading up, startup founders can be caricatured as thinking they know everything and not willing to learn, but often they're actually open to their trusted leadership having a hard conversation about how they need to stop what I call the swoop and poop, where they just show up and completely change everything in favor of means of communication and tasking that is more likely to produce the output they want from their devs. Again, you want to put it in their language. A lot of this video has less to do with how the teams interact with each other and more to do with how the leaders of the teams interact with each other, and also how they do or don't effectively represent the interests and concerns of their teams. I've said this in previous videos, but if you don't have at the head of your engineering department a technical leader with a large amount of power, you're going to end up with these problems or others, because it's unreasonable to expect the non-technical leaderships of your organization to understand the needs and constraints and concerns and fears and desires of the engineering team, which means you either need an incredible organization with just unbelievable cross-disciplinary communication, or B, you need a technical leader who gets why the engineers' priorities matter and can speak to them across silos. In the end, this concept of the development team's relationship with the rest of the organization really just comes down to how well the engineering leadership team interfaces between their team members' desires and concerns and those of the rest of the organization. It's going to mean critical conversations, intentional and often difficult interactions, and knowing when to draw a line, both with the rest of your organization and with your team. You might be surprised to see this on the list of videos, since Titan has a reputation of telling people we don't estimate. But despite all of my ideology of #NoEstimates, there are still contexts in which we need to give a client, or usually more often a prospective client, some sort of sense of what something's going to cost and how long it's going to take. So how do we strike the balance? Clients, whether true clients in an agency sense or the client of an in-house dev team, which is usually product or business or whomever, desire an understanding of how long a given feature is going to take and how much it's going to cost. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with this desire. If I hire someone to build me a house and they say, we don't know how much it's going to cost or how long it's going to take, I'd be pretty frustrated, right? The business side of the organization needs to be able to figure out where that money's going to come from, how to build marketing around their timelines, and also how to adjust the work and timelines of the rest of the organization around the development work. So these aren't unreasonable desires. The issue is that they think that just because that's a reasonable desire, it can actually be met. So let's think back to when I asked someone to build me a house. Let's check in. Is this a house they've built before? Well, then I expect they're going to be pretty freaking close in their estimate because they've done it before. But what if it's a custom house? They've built houses before, but they've never built this house. So they use their previous experience in building houses to give me a guess, but in the end, it's just that, it's a guess. And if you've ever built a house before, you know it's always going to cost anywhere between 1.5 to 2 times what they told you up front. It's just sort of a given in building houses, building custom houses, that is. And that's the problem. Estimates are always inaccurate, unless you've done it before, in which case it's mainly accurate, but still somewhat inaccurate. And if anybody's ever actually worked with teams that promise deadlines, you know from personal experience, at the end of the project, you either cut scope, you extend timeline, and or somebody's losing money. So why is this? Well, for starters, we never know less about a project than we do on day one. We never know everything that's coming. We've never done exactly this project in exactly these circumstances. So there's always a big bunch of guesswork, and there's no way to know ahead of time what's going to happen. And this awareness that all estimates are inaccurate has led to a bit of a movement or a conversation called #NoEstimates. It was originally introduced by Woody Zuwill on Twitter mainly. It's a conversation around the detrimental effect estimation has on software development teams. And while the hashtag says no estimates, if you read the content of their work and their blog posts and look at the talks from Woody and other folks proclaiming no estimates, they're really usually just pointing out that estimates don't help developers. They're not a necessary or even beneficial part of the software development process. And I would make the case, and I think they would as well, that estimation is actually, beyond that, it's dangerous for developers. It's harmful. So first of all, estimation is time spent not developing, which is wasteful in the first place, and it's important to minimize time spent not developing as much as possible. But second of all, estimation most commonly leads to expectations of delivery in a given amount of time. So we get toward the end of the project, and because estimates are inaccurate, we push our devs, we burn them out, we stress them out, and basically everybody's unhappy in this scenario. Imagine Office Space, I'm gonna need you to come work the weekend. So how do we solve these problems? There have been a few ways that people have tried to address these issues, a few kind of comments what I see. And number one is plan every tiny single detail. Maybe you're willing to eat the costs of planning. Maybe you do a paid discovery, but either way, you basically spend as much time planning as you will eventually spend developing. I personally would argue that you're going to get a significantly worse outcome because, among many other reasons, your requirements are going to change halfway to the project, and now all that time spent planning will be wasted. But it does address some of these concerns. I don't think it's a good answer, but it is at least a little bit of an answer. The second thing people tend to do is just add a percentage above the estimate, maybe add 25% or 30% above every estimate. And this helps a bit, but there's no guarantee that you've padded it enough. And now you start getting clients, again, internal or external, unwilling to work with you because they ask for a small thing and you're planning it to be this massive, amount of work. You become expensive, whether literally expensive or internally expensive. The third common thing that I see is for people, especially in the agile world, to stop working with time-based estimates and start using story points or t-shirt sizes or something else like that as a sort of attempt to estimate without estimating. And this was something really fun that I learned while researching this project. Ron Jeffries, who is credited with the invention of the concept of story points in the first place, said, "Story points were invented to obfuscate duration so that certain managers will not pressure their team over estimates." So the whole point of story points is to protect us from people who couldn't help getting stuck on imperfect estimates, but also wouldn't accept the concept of just no estimates at all. So unfortunately, story points, while designed to protect the developer, have been swallowed up in the agile processes, along with velocity and sprints and other things that had relatively good intentions. And now they're just another way to tell devs they should work harder and faster, and they've lost that kind of magic of obfuscation, basically. And the last kind of thing that I often see people try to work with is the idea of estimating in ideal time instead of real time. And so it's a sort of way to communicate to clients that if everything went well, if everything went the way we're guessing it would go, including you communicated your needs up front well enough, even though we know it won't, this is how long it would take. And this is similar to sort of the original plan of, just taking a certain percent above, but maybe you don't take the percent above initially. You just say, here's the ideal estimate. We all know it's going to go over this, but let's just start from here. And that'll depend on the client and the team, whether there's any value in actually doing that. So those are some options that people work with. Here's what we do at Titan. For starters, we try to avoid estimates, if at all possible. That is the vast majority of the interactions we have, is just saying, hey, estimation is not actually going to help us out here. I say all the things I'm saying here, but much more concise in our business development processes and our relationship building with clients. And we get the client instead to give us a few weeks of our time, and we just show how productive we can be in that time. And universally, if a client is willing to agree to that, when they see how fast our team works, they stop worrying so much about estimates and they start worrying about how they're going to be capable of keeping up with our developers. It's very common for them to say, hey, we need a pause and then let's book again because we can't keep up and we need to be more prepared, right? They'll book more time with us and we're ready to go. But let's say we can't avoid estimates. We can't get a sign-off for this client without getting a budget, and we decide it's worth working with them anyway. That's usually going to be with a nonprofit. A lot of businesses think they have to have an estimate, and we're going to push really hard on them. But nonprofits often are in situations where, for example, they need to know how much it's going to cost before they can even write the grant to get the money to pay us to work. It's just an unbreakable requirement. So how do we match our thoughts around protecting developers and being honest and transparent with this constraint? Well, to start, remember the best estimates come from what you've already done before. So if I've installed 700 toilets, I can estimate with a pretty good amount of confidence how much this next toilet is going to take. And at Titan, I've started using that concept to give out something that I call a ballpark. And a ballpark is not some new idea that I'm going to write a book about and make a domain for. It's literally just my preferred language around what a lot of people call elapsed time. And what I'm trying to tell our prospective clients here is, when we've done something similar in the past, it's taken around this amount of time, which costs around this amount of money. So if you have to set aside money, that's a reasonable amount to set aside, and that's it. To the client, I have to make this really clear. There's no promise that that's what your project is going to cost, but it is at least a reasonable place to start guessing or budgeting. And then if we book the project, we're going to do the absolute best work that can be done within that budget, whether or not the work we're doing is actually even remotely related to the original plan, which often it's not. You may notice this is very similar to an estimate, for sure. Like an estimate, we're trying to figure out how much something is going to cost, and like an estimate, the client could take it and run with it and think, well, Titan promised this is what it's going to cost, so what really makes it different? Basically, just like with story points, we're purely trying to use language that gets people to stop thinking an estimate can predict the future. We're using differing language of ballpark instead of estimate, plus a lot of other words and caveats that we say around the concept to make sure they know we are only describing what similar work has taken in the past, not what this work could take. And you can use any language. You can call it elapsed time or whatever else. We're trying to make it very clear to them that this is not an estimate that you can use as a future prediction. And then, and this is very important, we actually build that language into our legal documentation. Now, if you're an internal team, it probably doesn't matter as much, but as contractors, it's very valuable to our statements of work and our contracts to actually say we're only going to promise to do the best work we can in the given timeline. And sometimes the SOWs may list out, and these 5 items will be addressed, but the fidelity of how those items will be addressed and delivered can be variable depending on how long things take and how things go. But we can't have that language be a surprise. So we have to lean really heavily on communicating this in initial conversations with clients And then if estimates are absolutely necessary, when we tried to talk them out of them, make sure they know that what our estimates are and are not, or our ballparks. And then we also have to make tons of disclaimers to let them know what the legal situation is so that nobody ends up seeing, this legal situation either now or in the future and being surprised. At an organization where you as a developer or development team are just assigned full-time on a project, with no concerns you're just going to be taken off when a certain cost has been spent, you have a lot more freedom to pursue alternate ways of planning your work. And this is often when something like Basecamp's shape-up methodology works, or other systems where you commit to ship some version of some feature in a given amount of time, and then if it needs more work, you just iterate from there. And in this sort of setting, the most important goal is to pick the most important thing to work on, split it into the smallest pieces you can, and do the most important of those pieces first. And we actually already talked about this in the video about task process in your organization, so I'd recommend you check it out if you haven't seen it yet. So if you are working this way, then when your organization asks you how long a larger task is going to take or a larger feature is going to take, the best answer to that, if possible, is to say, I'm going to pick up the most important piece of this feature and I'm going to ship something within a week. And then I'm going to do that again and again until you're happy, which might even be just after a week, depending. And if the best estimation happens based on work we've already done, then if you need more, if they're asking for you to deliver more planning, at least you could say, once I've done a week of work on this project with my current team, I have a much better sense of what progress can be made in the second week and the third week. And they can expect this similar process to continue happening and have a better understanding of process, pace, or you might think velocity of this team. And we start seeing the healthier side of velocity here, not a goal or something that can be controlled, but a measure of the past that we can use to make informed decisions about the future. And I'm completely aware this isn't a perfect answer, but the goal for me here is, as much as possible, to change the conversation with product and business leadership from tell me exactly when this fully fleshed feature is going to ship to what is the best thing we can do for this organization this week. So to wrap this up, estimates are bad for developers and development teams. They're always wrong, and in custom software development, they're usually even more wrong. We don't have any great tools to make estimates better. Rather, we have tools that try somewhat pathetically to protect us from people who unreasonably expect perfect estimates and expect them to predict the future accurately. At Titan, we try to avoid estimates as much as possible, and when we have to for legitimate business purposes, we use legal language, endless caveats, and the word ballpark to try and distance ourselves from the expectation that any description we make of past work is any kind of commitment to timelines for future work. So your number one goal should be to forego estimates entirely. And if you can't, you should do everything in your power to make it clear that an estimate by any name can't reasonably be a commitment to future timelines. Good luck. Management responsibility is one of those strange things where the moment you get that job, you've spent your whole life usually doing something other than that job, and you now have to jump into this with no training to do what is often the most uniquely demanding job you've ever had prior to that. And the moment you move to management from whatever you did before, often programming, but whatever else, you're likely reaching for an entirely unique set of skills compared to your previous job. And managing finances is one of those universal things that managers across all types of organizations just have absolutely no preparation for. And hell, most managers don't know how to manage their personal finances, let alone that of an organization. So for the sake of this video, I'm just going to talk about what it costs to run the finances of the dev team, not the broader company or organization or agency. We'll assume that somebody else is either giving you a budget or they're asking you to make your desired budget to make your dev team work. So when we're thinking about budgets for development teams, usually, even though you want to know the overall cost, the biggest questions are around how much each developer costs to employ, not things that are shared across all the developers. So we're usually trying to imagine for every single employee, every single developer, what is the total annual cost to employ this person? As you can probably guess, salary is the largest part of that number, but there's also other costs that scale up and down based on the number of developers that you have, and we'll cover those later. You're likely coming at these questions from either one of two perspectives. First, you might have a budget. If so, you're going to try to figure out the ideal arrangement of your team that matches that budget. So go take a look at the earlier video about the ideal structure of a dev team, figure out how to build a team that fits that structure within your given budget. Or the second option is you may have been assigned to build a team and you need to know how much it'll cost. And usually it's not just build any team, it's usually build a team and we have a general sense of what we're talking about. So again, just put together a team based on what we talked about before that makes the most sense in your general range. Combine that with what we're about to talk about with all the various costs of employing developers, and then you will have a number or a range to provide. So either way, let's walk through the various costs that comprise this cost to employ this developer this year number. First up, salary. The highest cost on any development team is going to be salary. And unfortunately, I can't tell you what a reasonable salary is for your roles because it varies so heavily across different roles, different skill levels, different areas of the world. And so it's just so unpredictable that I can't tell you what your specific salary cost can be. But I can help you think about it a little bit and think about how salaries are going to impact your budgeting and your team building. First thing you need to do is figure out what reasonable developer salaries are for your needs in your specific organization, in the geographic location and or the remoteness that you're allowing. This is going to take those things into consideration and many other things like, are you looking for front end or back end or full stack? What is your front end stack? What's your back end stack? What overall ability level do you require? You can have those different bands, those different roles, but you can go up and down within the roles. And are there any edge case skills? They have to know Kubernetes or they have to be Microsoft experts or whatever. And also think about the benefits that you offer. That can, have a pretty big impact on the salary cost as well. What other benefits are they getting or not getting? There is no easy formula I can give for you here. I wish I could, but you are going to need to do your own research here. But I can at least tell you, get started researching in Glassdoor and also look at other companies in your general arena who list their salaries and their job postings. And some do this because of the kindness of their hearts. Some do this because it's legally required. But either way, that information is out there so you can do some research of your own there. I can tell you, at least in the United States, salaries tend to be grouped along a couple kind of different bands or groupings of them. So you got brand new developers. They're straight out of college or they're straight out of boot camp. You've got entry-level developers, which are sometimes differentiated from brand new because they might have a year or two of experience and they're probably not super professional, but they've at least done the job before. You usually have some kind of a mid-developer scale, and mid-developers are usually folks who've been doing this for 2, 3, 5 years. They're good enough, but they're not leading teams. And then usually there's the senior developers, and seniority is not always just about time. It's often about, familiarity with the tech stack at a more expert level. It's about ability to lead teams. Also, it's about time. It's even sometimes about how much have they devoted their lives to this particular tech stack versus being generalists. It's a lot harder to be a senior developer when you're a generalist. And then above that, you get the CTO level folks, and those are usually you. They're usually people who are at leadership levels, and you're probably not going to be hiring them because, again, they are you or they're people you're working together with. Each of these bands have a general kind of like range of salaries they'll expect, but again, there's still a whole bunch of exceptions and caveats and variables that configure those, even just down to are you working at an agency versus a product company? Huge shift between those same roles in each of those. So figure out what those salary bands are in your area and your tech stack and all these other pieces, and then figure out the roles you want to hire. Or if you would prefer, you figure out the roles you want to hire based on how much those roles cost. When we first started Titan, my first development hire was someone I spent a lot of time pouring into. And this is in part because mentorship is super important to me, but also because even if I wanted to hire a senior developer, we couldn't afford one at the time. And it was actually quite a while before we could afford to hire a senior developer. Our first several hires were all people who I kind of helped into the industry. And, they weren't all brand new, but none of them were at senior level either. So at some point, you're going to have the salary part figured out. You're going to figure out who are we hiring and how much should we pay for them. And you're going to understand the basics of at least salary. So after salary, what's next? Well, next is the physical hardware developers need to do their jobs. So I'm talking at minimum a computer, but this often includes a desk, monitor, chair, headphones, keyboard, mouse, the whole shebang. In general, you're going to want to have a guideline for what computer devs get and how much it can cost. You may just have one fixed configuration they get, or maybe a few fixed options they can choose from. And you're going to do the same for every other item they'll be purchasing, and also a spec for when they do or don't get each of these items. Finally, you're going to have a general guess of how frequently those items will be replaced per developer, and that will help you do cost predictions, but it'll also help you decide how to respond if your dev team asks for upgrades. So here's what we do at Titan. First of all, for every item, we only buy it if it's needed. Do you have a machine that can do the job when you start here? Then use that for now, and we'll buy you a replacement when it's time. Same for a desk, a chair, keyboard, mouse, whatever else. Second, we don't have exact items they have to purchase, but instead general guidelines and a general price range. So for computers, for example, we say it's a Mac laptop that should last at least 3 years as a daily driver web development machine. And we have a max cost associated with it. But within those guidelines, the employee can configure it to their liking. For other equipment, we have different guidelines. We'll buy a $100 keyboard, but not a $500 clicky masterpiece. We'll help get a desk, but there's a few trusted brands that we think give us a good balance of quality and cost. We'll buy a chair, but we encourage everybody to get one of a few higher quality brands, but then get them refurbed or office resale. And then third, we do have some general expectations for these items' longevity. For example, for laptops, 3 years is a safe minimum, although we hope we get quite a bit more out of them. Desks and chairs, monitors, keyboards, mouses. We hope they last longer, and we use this information to expand our understanding of the average cost per year of each developer, because we can now say how often are we going to have to replace each of these pieces of equipment, and what's their general average hardware cost going to be per year. In the end, it is our goal to make sure every developer has everything they need to be productive and work in a healthy ergonomic workspace without going just hog wild and throwing money at every new hire. It's always a balance. And of course, you'll also need to pay for software for developers, but it's actually less than you would think, considering the fact that we work on computers all day and program computers. With software, it's very similar to hardware. We just want to say, what software do you need in order to do your job? But for most of our devs, we're literally just paying for a Table Plus or some other database access software and some kind of an IDE, and a lot of them even use a free IDE, maybe some plugins here or there. And that's really it for the majority of the developers. And your needs may vary. I know in the past we've paid for testing tools, responsive design tools, Adobe Creative Suite items, and more. But right now, literally most of our folks want, PHP Storm and Table Plus, and they're happy. Now, outside of the software individual developers use on their computers to do their specific development work, we also pay for quite a few centralized software as a service type platforms that our team uses. Now, of course, there's those that are company-wide that we happen to use in the development team. That's things like Slack and Harvest and Zoom and Google Suite and Airtable. They are not developer specific. Everybody else is using them, but you still have to add another seat to them for each developer. And then there's also dev specific services. Interestingly, most of these services, while you're paying for a seat for each developer, the service itself is actually more used for deploying to a product or running a project rather than specific and necessary to that developer. So again, these are more like services everybody uses, but you buy seats for each programmer, like GitHub, exception trackers. We use Laravel, so we've got subscriptions to Forge and Envoy and Cloud and Nightwatch, and you've got things like TypeSense, Mailtrap, and Grok, tools of the trade that are a functional part of doing our day-to-day developer work, whether as a part of development, as a part of staging, or as a part of production, but usually a little bit more attached to the team or the project and just buying seats versus, buying a copy of this software for each developer. And as I'm sure you can guess, AI services are also an increasing cost. So you're going to want to add another seat on GitHub and Zoom and Dropbox and Slack and all these other tools as a part of your total metric for how much does it cost to hire a new developer for a year. When I think about other recurring costs we incur per every developer, the top one that comes up after this is usually educational stuff, like courses and books and subscriptions to education sites like Laracasts. We want to make sure our developers have access to the highest quality training material so they know how to stay up to date on everything that is important to their job with us. And the cost of this training doesn't come close to the amount of benefit we get from having devs that are up to date on all the latest and greatest. Part of building up our devs is not just these training resources, but also sending them out to meetups and conferences. And I cannot begin to tell you the positive impact it makes to send a developer to a good conference. So first, we learn better in person than we do on YouTube, and I wish that wasn't the case, but it's just something about being around people and connecting with them and getting excited about them, doing the same thing that just makes what you learn stick better. But second of all, your devs are going to build professional networks at conferences, and these are valuable to them for their careers, which we care about because we're good people and good managers, but it's also valuable for the company or the organization to now have a direct connection to folks all around the world doing the same work, half of whom probably are creating and maintaining packages that we rely on every day. And third, your developers represent your organization at these conferences, and there's no better way to meet potential candidates for your company than at a conference. So set a budget for ongoing education and for conferences every year. And your team might not use it all, but I would definitely budget it as if they will. Finally, we are landing on the goodies. You have to make sure to budget for these because it's so easy to leave them behind, but they are so valuable in developer happiness. And this is especially true for raises. I'm hoping your parent organization already has this managed, but if not, the cost of raises on top of employees often making six figures can spiral out of control if you have not planned for it in the first place. And the healthier you make your workplace, the longer people stay, the more raises they get. And you don't want to stop giving raises, of course, but you need to know ahead of time that you can afford to keep giving them for your team or you're going to be in bad shape. Bonuses also are usually a company-wide thing paid off of profits. So I'm hoping that's managed by your larger organization and you don't have to think about that right now. So that leaves treats. Now, whether or not treats are a part of your corporate culture, I strongly recommend you build in the occasional gift, pizza party, special side dinner, team onsite, or whatever else into your overall budget. Look for moments to brighten a team member's day, to tell the whole team you appreciate their hard work on that difficult week, or to give a specific hardworking dev some kind of kudos. It really goes a long way. And if you can, I'd also recommend setting aside a portion of your budget to sponsor community initiatives in your tech stack. And this might mean buying pizza a few times for your local meetup, sponsoring your community's conference, or giving back to a community-led diversity initiative. And I'd also recommend setting aside a portion of your budget to financially support the work of open source project maintainers your team relies on. No one has more power than you to show the work of these maintainers as a foundational part of doing business and to reward them for that work. Okay, so at this point you have a general sense of the average annual cost of employing each developer. Most of managing your team's finances works around ensuring those costs fit within your budget. So once you have this information, it actually all seems kind of simple, right? Like, what makes it complex from here? Well, this is not the only answer, but it's definitively complex when there is a mismatch between your team size and your budget in either direction. Maybe your budget shrank since your original team size was created. Maybe your budget stayed the same, but everybody's salaries, or maybe even just the cost of hardware and software went up. Or maybe you're being asked to increase your team, but you know this increase may be temporary, or you're being given more budget, but that budget is not quite enough to bring on another developer. What do we do in all of those scenarios? So we've already talked about hiring and firing in previous videos, so that at least gives you kind of the basics of what it looks like to make your team bigger and smaller. But there is another tool in your tool belt: contractors. And this could be individual contractors, individuals who are working part-time or full-time for you, or even all the way up to agencies like Titan. Either way, contract labor allows you to scale up your staff temporarily rather than permanently. And this might be temporarily until this budget surplus runs out, or temporarily until you can find the right person to work full-time in this position, or temporarily until the budget increases again, because right now it's not enough to support an entire new employee, but you could bring in some contract work. In each of these scenarios, you can break off chunks of your development work and pass them to a trusted outside dev or team and use that remaining budget to get great work done. Now, I run the finances of my entire company and have for a few years, and as far as I can tell, these are really the only factors I have to contend with financially that are unique to running a dev team. You got salary, the equipment and software to do the job, and the services that support it, education and conferences and meetups, treats, bonuses, raises, and sponsorships. And if you can build these things into a basic spreadsheet, you've got basically everything you need to manage your team's finances. As you can likely imagine, there are just as many things that I want you to not do as there are things I want you to do in your engineering management career. And even in these previous videos, I was often not just thinking what has worked well for me, but what have I seen done poorly and how do I flip that into a positive? But the thing is, it's not always enough just to talk about the positives. Some of these things need to be explicitly called out as problems and dealt with directly. And sometimes even that's not enough, but we at least have to start here by saying, hey, these are things. Please stop doing these things and call it exactly what it is as we do. So I've got 12 examples. I split them up into 4 different categories: leadership issues, team issues, technical planning issues, and the wrong responses to problems. So let's get started with leadership issues. Now, I've talked about this in a previous video, but I want to mention it again because it is so common. The leader of your technical organization needs to be someone who is technically competent. And what I mean by this is someone who is at the most senior level of the engineering organization or the programming organization or whatever else. So not necessarily the CEO, but the director of engineering or the director of technology or the CTO should actually be a technologist, not a manager with a little bit of a hobby for technology. Preferably the leader of your engineering organization should actually be an engineer. If it's a programming team, preferably their leader should be a programmer. And it's not impossible to build a productive team with a non-technical leader of the technical organization, but it's asking for unnecessary pain. When the person who's tasked with representing the needs and the concerns of the programmers at the company doesn't actually have any experience programming, or not just programming, but the non-technical aspects of the programming experience, like having to balance speed and stability, or to take on technical debt to hit a deadline, or to let go of the desire to code something beautiful for the sake of caring for the needs of the business. And not having the experience of doing those things is going to make it very difficult for that person to both advocate for that, but then also to know when it's appropriate to push back. I would say the most acceptable compromise here is when you have a senior level leader of the technical organization who honors and respects the most senior actual programmers in that organization, so that if those devs say something is the case, the leader believes it and goes to bat for them. Oof, the number of times I've seen this one. It's most common with younger companies, startups, and scale-ups, and what happens is they've used one tech stack to get this far. They built MVPs and proof of concepts and, what feels like kind of maybe smaller, more throwaway stuff. And then time comes for them to get all grown up and bring in a C-suite and often a CTO, and they neglect to get a CTO that actually works in their existing tech stack. So a new CTO comes in who seems really compelling in the interview process, and the first thing they do is say, we got to throw away at everything. This is all terrible. But the good news is I've got some programmers from my last job. I'll bring them in and we'll rewrite the whole thing in our favorite tech stack. What they're missing here is a lot of things. First of all, usually they didn't just build MVPs and POCs, but they actually built the initial core version of their application, including encoding a lot of business logic into this application. Additionally, usually the existing team members are now going to have to get booted out because A, they're not, your people, and B, they don't work in this new tech stack. So you've lost those people that you built relationship with, and you've lost all of their knowledge and experience. And what happens is these startups usually end up basically regressing 6 to 12 months as soon as they do this. And the CTO is going to promise they can knock it out in a couple months, and they never do. Like never, ever once in the history of time has that CTO's promised that they can rewrite the whole thing and it's going to be faster and better and it's going to be real quick, and it actually happened. It's just not a thing that happens. So don't fall prey to this. If you have a tech stack and an application that works, and it's been supporting your company up to this point, find a technical leader in that tech stack to get you through the next phase. And if you're still having trouble with that and that tech stack is Laravel, hit me up. I will find you someone before I let you throw your whole thing away. The Superman Senior Developer. Most of us have met at least one of these people in our time as developers. That's a traditional kind of 10x developer, able to handle every single problem, work in every single context, work in every single language. They're amazing, right? Like everybody loves them, right? A careful examination usually makes it clear that while this developer is incredibly productive on their own, they're usually incapable of working on teams or building systems that anybody but them can or wants to maintain. And it may not be intentional, but intentional or not, it's slowing down the productivity in the entire team and honestly the technology growth of the entire team, because they slowly take over every single piece of the technology layout until every single thing has to go through them or one of their systems. And these people often talk about how much they wish that wasn't the case. Oh, my hours are so long, it's so hard to take a vacation. And so you maybe end up even feeling grateful that they're doing all this, and often rightfully so, they're probably working really hard. But in the end, your organization can't scale, and it can't be healthy if so much is tied in one person. You have to work to the point where eventually every employee, no matter how productive, is not able to be the choke point for your entire organization or your company or your systems. On the other side of the developer capability spectrum, one of the most common issues I see when folks are building new development teams is that they load them full of entry-level or junior programmers. And usually this is just out of a desire to get cheap labor, combined with how easy it is to find less experienced devs, and sometimes mixed with A little bit of good intentionality for helping with the hiring pipeline and also joining in a little bit of just inexpert hiring, where sometimes smooth-talking juniors are given roles as if they weren't juniors. But in the end, you have an entire team of liabilities. They drag the small remainder of your capable programmers down, they waste money, and they make the whole team look bad, and therefore they cause all sorts of issues from there that then negatively affect the few capable programmers you actually have, and they're far too much of a force for your experienced devs to be able to wrangle them and mentor them, especially not while actually writing their own code. Bringing on junior programmers is great. It's a valuable action both for your team, because of what they bring to you in terms of perspectives and growth potential, and also for the industry and the programmers themselves. For your team, juniors are the people most likely to bring fresh perspectives because the longer somebody's been coding, the more likely they are to be from the same background and the same set of experiences as everybody else at your organization. And the industry is better because we'll never have people who make it past junior unless someone somewhere is willing to hire juniors. So junior programs, apprentice programs are great. Please do it. But that doesn't mean you can just fill your entire team with them. It's just not going to be functional. Keep it measured. I've said this before, but 1 junior to 2 experienced programmers at most. Along the same vein, another common cost-cutting tactic employed in development teams or in place of development teams is when folks hire cheap, often offshore developers to do the work. And the thinking often goes, if these developers cost 1/4 my normal developer's salary, and they'll probably put out like maybe half the value, I've won, right? 2x the productivity. Look at how economical I am. But the problem is, even if those developers were giving you 3/4 of the output at 1/4 the cost, or even maybe the same output in terms of numbers of lines of code at 1/4 the cost, it's still not worth it. And there's a reason these developers are cheap. It's like buying a cheap car or cheap food or cheap clothing. It looks the same on the outside, right? But when that cheap car breaks down in 2 years, or when your cheap food gives you heart disease, when your cheap clothing falls apart and is made of plastic, you understand why it's cheap, right? Like, you're not dumb. You're capable of saying, I know that this thing is cheap because it's made of these bad materials, and I've been willing to make that compromise. The same is true for hiring cheap contractors. There's a reason they're cheap. The output may look fine on the outside, although it doesn't always, but they're going to cut corners, they write spaghetti code, they build unsustainable architectures, they miss security concerns. It's not worth it. Hire capable developers and pay them what they're worth. All right, I keep saying this, but the mythical man month is also a very common issue. This one's so common, in fact, that Fred Brooks wrote about it in an essay in 1975. Yes, we were writing computer programming books in 1975. The general idea is that you have a computer programming project that's running late. Let's say you've got 8 programmers with 2 months left of deadline, but 4 months left of work. So what do? Well, you add 8 more programmers, right? If 8 of them are going to take 4 months, then 60 of them should take 2 months, right? Unfortunately, that's not actually how it works out. As he writes in his essay, it's sort of like saying it takes 1 woman 9 months to make 1 baby, so why don't we just take 9 women and have them each take a month, and we'll have a baby at the end, right? But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way with babies, and it doesn't work that way with computer programming. And there's a lot of reasons for this. One of the biggest factors here is because the increased costs for onboarding, for communication, for inter-dev friction, just in general in terms of numbers of people, those are all issues all the time, but they're especially problematic at the end of a late project. And so if you're saying, oh, we've got to rush, you got to onboard 8 more people, you got to add 2x the amount of communication capacity and process workflow and split the things up well so they're not stepping on each other's feet, it just doesn't end up actually working. And while Brooks' law is primarily about late projects, and I think that is the place that is the best way for us to consider it, I think it's also very applicable in a lot of ways, not 100%, to non-late projects. Each project can support only so many people, so large of a team, before it costs more time and money to handle the process and the communication and the workflows than it did to actually benefit you in terms of cost by the speed that you're getting from having this team. Overall, the actual productivity and speed is not increased while your costs are increased. It's not worth it. And so basically the recommendation here would be, first of all, don't think that adding more programmers is going to make your late project not late. It's just not going to work out and you're stuck. But even on non-late projects, consider the fact that there's an ideal size for each project, and adding more people is not free. And there's kind of a weight of, the size that project should be before it has to get so heavy that either it can't be productive at all, or it now needs to get big enough to support that heaviness that you've added. Now, how often have you seen a company adopt microservices or Kubernetes or whatever the latest fad is just because their hero does it? They saw a talk from AWS, which is a multi-trillion-dollar company or whatever, and they preach microservices, so then we should use microservices too, right? But the thing is, AWS, for example, has like 100 times more developers than you. Their problems are not your problems, and so their solutions should not be your solutions. And it's very clear that a team of 5 does not have the same issues or the same options for resolving their issues the team of 500 has. So you need to work within the constraints and the benefits of the specific team you have today. So for example, with microservices, sure, it's great when you have 50 people working on auth alone for auth to be a separated service that they own, right? But what if auth is one of 22 concerns one developer is responsible for? The only impact you make by changing the microservices for auth and other things is your deploy story is harder, your development feature branching story is harder, your communication across your team is harder, and even individual features or bugs are 2 or 3 times as hard to manage because you're now going to have to deploy and coordinate and synchronize deploys across 4 different code bases to fix that one feature. The cost and the friction of deploying development across your entire stack is significantly impacted. Why? Because you saw some big company doing something that doesn't make sense for you. So this is another one we've covered to some degree in previous videos, but it does merit another mention in this section. It is painfully common that when a company has a really strong delineation between the product side of the company and the engineering side of the company, at some point product is going to start looking at the desires and requests of the engineering team as being more concerned with their nerdy late obsessions than with the success of the business we should all be shared in. And they are not always wrong, but the worst and unfortunately most common outcome from this is that addressing technical debt gets thrown in this pile of things those nerds are always asking for instead of stuff that actually matters. And that's a huge issue for the company. The good news is, if leadership is reasonable, it's usually pretty easy to converse your way out of this. You connect managing technical debt with reducing risk for the company, and you usually can get some approval for it, but it's still an extremely common problem and one to watch out for. We often talk about shiny object syndrome as devs' kind of like obsession with the latest and greatest, and we treat it sort of like a ADHD hyperfocus thing, right? It's like the dog in Up who's like, squirrel, and just constantly distracted and jumping from focus to focus. But shiny object syndrome can also be a bigger issue in the planning and architecture phases of your development, not just in the day-to-day life of individual developers. It's because when time comes to decide how you're going to structure a new application or a new section of your application or whatever else, there's often a tendency to assume that newer technology means better technology. So we could use server-rendered HTML for this front end, but obviously Next.js is the answer because it's newer and better and greater and sexier, right? Like that's just what we need to do. But one of the most important aspects of deciding the tech stack for either an existing application or a new piece of application or whatever else it is what is your team already familiar with? And if it's a new section, it's not just what is a team familiar with, but is what is the rest of the application built in? And I'm not saying you shouldn't ever modernize when your existing tech is out of date or that your devs should never learn new technologies, but I would say err on the side of caution. If a new tool is the new sexy, it's exactly that. It's sexy, so your judgment may be impaired and a little bit less pragmatic, and it's new, so your developers aren't as experienced in it. There might not be as much support and tooling around it compared to the tools that you already have in your application. Now, shiny object syndrome is about picking something sexy and new instead of the tried and true. But it also has a cousin, which is picking something more complex because you have a problem and your current system is simple, so obviously the answer is complexity, right? Pro tip, that's not almost ever actually the answer. Just because your server-rendered system, your simple models and controllers and Yagni system or whatever else has a problem, it doesn't mean that the simplicity is the problem or that complexity will actually solve the problem that you're having. So, for example, just because your models are poorly organized, it doesn't mean you need to move to repositories. Maybe just organize your models. Just because your directories are getting a bit full as your model count grows, it doesn't mean you need to go full DDD. Maybe just organize your folders a little bit better. When you run into a problem, the first step is to try and solve it inside of the existing system, in the simple system that you have right now as is. Otherwise, you're just going to be bringing all the same problems you had before that came not from the system that you're in necessarily, but from your team's ignorance or lack of effort to actually fix it. And now you're going to inject all those problems into, wait for it, a more complicated system that has more friction, that takes more effort to maintain, that's harder for new developers to learn, but you didn't fix any of the problems in the first place. So the first thing to do is try and solve the problem in the original system before you look at anything more complicated. Similar to the tendency to reach for complexity in our code when our simple apps have coding issues and architecture issues, development leaders also have a tendency to reach for process complexity when our simpler processes show any issues at all. So let's say you're struggling to keep on top of tasking. What are we going to reach for? You might assume that the next thing to reach for is immediately jump into hiring a Scrum Master and spending the next 9 months trying to retrain the team on the Scrum development format. But instead, take a moment and lead. And I don't mean that condescendingly, but I'm saying don't delegate the figuring out what the next step is there. So pause, talk to your team, figure out what's going wrong, and ask yourselves, can we solve these problems in our current system, just like we did in code? The client complains they're not getting enough up-to-date information about your team's process. So sure, you could immediately adopt a massively complex ticketing system that promises pixel-perfect burn downs and requires your entire team to rework every aspect of how they pick and track tasks. Or you can ask your team to write a few bullet points in Slack at the end of the day about their work. It's not that all process is bad, but all process comes with a cost. And just because it's complicated or expensive or has a little trademark sign after its name doesn't mean it's actually going to solve any of your problems that you had before. And here's our final common mistake, which applies not just to development leaders, but to all leaders. This mistake is talking a very good game in some way or another about how the team is about your family, about how, you have some kind of flexibility or understanding or bonus or whatever, something that makes you feel good in showing that you're a cool boss and you're making a good place for everybody to work. And then when it becomes expensive or difficult to actually provide that thing, backing out. And it's so fun to be the leader everybody loves when it doesn't cost you anything to be the cool boss. But you and I both know that is just taking advantage of a system that's already stacked in your favor as the leader. If you want to talk about something you're going to offer your team or something you're going to save them from, be ready up front to back up your promises when it's hardest to do so. So don't commit now unless you're willing to keep it up when it actually costs you something. And that's it, both for this list and for this course. And I so hope that this course has been a valuable experience for you, and something I've shared here has either helped teach you or helped validate something you were already doing or something you already believed, but you're walking away feeling like I am more capable or more confident in my leadership than I was before. If you have any questions or any concerns, you need any help in your journey, hit me up. I'm at StopForMatt on Twitter, or if you really need some help directly, hit me up, matt@titan.com. I would love to help.